And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And it's a great crowd tonight. We're going to do something very special here for X Series episode 67, which takes us deep into the Salem witch trial mysteries and combines it with its very unusual connections to the Hotzone. And this is something which I think is pretty remarkable as I was exploring it, because, you know, this episode is simultaneously an esoteric overview of the things that were happening in Salem and a great deal of archaeology in the Hotzone and how it's crisscrossed and connected through these mystery schools. And then those who are opposing the mystery schools, we'll call them the darker left-hand societies. So this is going to get us in really deep, and I know I can already see there's a lot of good questions and people out there tonight, so we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. I was originally going to be joined tonight by Gigi Young, but Gigi, you know, is on a beach, and the it just so happens that the internet that she's using was a little bit shaky, so she's going to come back with us to do a follow-up on this shortly. But you know, what can you do with the beach? I mean, the beach is the beach.
I don't want to rip her away from the beach. She should be enjoying her vacation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other thing is that, you know, it's interesting because there's so many things to cover in this episode that Olivia was saying, you know, it's 2 in 1. But what I can tell you is when we leave tonight, we're going to understand something that just has not been on the record. And this has been happening recently with the show quite a bit. We're used to kind of putting unusual details around the X-steganography on the record. But with this episode, there are historical crisscrosses that are going to help us to understand exactly how these groups operate that are working with mystery schools and how they are opposed by these other groups. I tend to elect these groups into X-protect and X-share in the modern political lexicon. So we see a lot of that going on. And as a matter of fact, for me, I have to say that the X-share activity is particularly obvious, and that the X-protect activity, in order to short-circuit that process, is particularly obvious when we get into areas of higher technology. Yes.
Everyone is saying your volume is a little low.
Oh,
if you
well,
can crank it.
I'll tell you, the last time I did that, I regretted it, but we'll see.
We'll try.
And we'll do a little tweak here.
Can I throw you a question while we're at it?
Yes.
Okay, so Enki wanted to know, DJ, why you ain't at Area 51, LOL.
Well, it's very interesting. There's been a lot going on there, but that, of course, is media hype that they know isn't going to go anywhere, so they love that in the media. For me, there's been a lot of things operating through Area 51 since the 1950s, and if there was any possibility of us getting a handle on that material, then it would have been moved to, you know, Area 52, as we know that already exists. And my feeling is that the real secret base and the best one to kind of keep an eye on if you want that kind of activity is Pine Gap in Australia, although I'm sure a lot still goes through there. But, you know, for the intrepid souls who journeyed to check it out, it's good. It's a good exercise in transparency and seeking transparency. So I definitely salute it. You know, there's so many news things that have been going on also in relation to Bolton and Trump and all these things. So we're just going to take a show out to cover all that stuff, but it's not going to be tonight. That's for sure. And a lot of very exciting things too, including the Robert Kennedy Jr.'s announcement that it was Thane Eugene Caesar who had assassinated his father. This is a major earthquake in deep politics on the deep state. I did an episode last year on Robert Kennedy's birthday, and it just so happens that, you know, well, it wasn't his birthday, it was the anniversary of his assassination, 1968, the 50th anniversary. And we covered Thane Eugene Caesar and his employer, Lockheed Martin, along with Howard Hughes, and that whole role in compromising Hughes' empire. And of course, Hughes comes up in all these episodes of the Hotzone. So whenever we're talking about these things, in fact, they are all related, as it turns out. But for me, I do feel like that's going to deserve an episode on its own. And so I've been looking deeply into that. However, tonight we are going deep into an esoteric circle, and we're going to snapshot something that happened close by here, only 30 miles away in Salem. And the deeper you look into that whole thing, which was this series of the famous Salem witch trials, which started in 1692 and then ended in 1693, with the hangings of some 20 individuals accused of witchcraft. There had been quite a lot of hysteria associated with this, and there's quite a lot of different ways to look at this. There are a lot of people who've done great historical overviews, and I recommend, there's always good books and documentaries about this subject. My principal interest in bringing it forward is that I think that we can get a bird's eye view of mystery school activity and opposition, and also I think we can connect it directly, and I mean directly, lock into the hot zone and the activities we've been describing there. So the tool that we have is exteganography. That's what makes a crucial difference when we go after these subjects. That's why we're able to get a handle on them. And there's more work to be done in such a way. I mean, I think I often say this with Olivia, but we basically covered about maybe 20% of what we've discovered about exteganography. So there's so much material around it, and so much of it that centers on the hot zone is key for me. The hot zone now, for those of you who don't know, is an area that lies basically off the coast of Florida to the western tip of Cuba and over to the Yucatan Peninsula. I've been given information that people who operate there, when they see ruins, if they're mapping the ocean floor or if they're working, for example, in the oil business, that they have to sign these NDAs that say, if you see any of that stuff, you can't talk about it and you can't photograph it. So the area is known by those contractors as the hot zone. That's where the term comes from. It may be an older term, but they're using it with a very definite meaning and thrust. And I think that a lot of this circles around the work of Polina Zalitsky, who's an oceanographer and engineer that we've talked about extensively on this program and have communicated with, and her work in bringing forward this incredible underwater city off the western tip of Cuba in 2001 is well known, even in mainstream media circles, but the story was dropped by the mainstream media, who was really afraid of the story, and they were trying to obscure it. They were kind of boxed into covering it in the first place. And then also on the other tip, when we look at even alternative researchers and alternative archaeology, Zalitsky is largely an outsider, so her work is often ignored. And I think when we think about her and her incredible achievements, this show is going to become, in many ways, a vehicle of pulling her work out from the depths and showing it, because it's the most extraordinary work. It's the thing that people have been looking for so long. And so we need to bring that back on board, and all of the hassle that she got from the Cuban government and others suffering through that. We need to find a way to kind of convince her that there are sane people out here who are very interested in her discoveries, and that kind of a lockdown on information is not something that we're going to tolerate in 2019. So we're going to go forward also with questions in the second half of the program. We're going to do a live Q&A, so you can ask the questions now, and Miss Olivia will put those together. How are we doing out there?
We are doing great. Should we get this out of the way right away?
Oh, no, we always say that for last.
Okay.
No, I always start with the TKO.
Okay.
That we'll do last.
All right, first
yeah,
question is, how did you even find a connection between the hot zone and the Salem witch trials? I mean, you would never connect those.
It's interesting. I was studying them both independently and ran across something quite remarkable. As you know, in the hot zone, I've done a lot of sort of talking about how there's an island in the hot zone called Bimini, where Edgar Cayce, the famous prophet and psychic, of the 20th century gave us all this information relating to an incredible temple and underwater ruins that were rising, actual land rising off the east coast of America. Now, this is very interesting because, you know, scientists will tell you, well, the ocean's rising there, but there are all sorts of oceanographic features that allow land to rise while that's happening. So the two they're not mutually exclusive. Now, one of the things that Cayce was saying, well, this is the first of a wave, you know, and it is mystery school doctrine that land is going to rise off the East Coast. Now, a number of groups, even celebrities and people like that, have been aware of this, and they've bought up lots in the Atlantic Ocean. And when they do that, they're hoping when that land rises, they can claim it and start a sovereign, independent nation. But what Cayce did, which is even more interesting, is he tied it into a land called Poseidia, which he said was a very advanced technological society that vanished about 10,000 years ago, and that we know in history as Atlantis, which is the story from Plato. Now, the story is often taken as a myth, etc. However, as we go further and further with satellite photography and all the rest of it, we're starting to discover that things are a lot older. As Graham Hancock told me when he came up here, things just keep getting older. And that's from a guy who's been watching it since the 1980s. A quick look at those ruins to make us understand the power of finding these things in the Hotzone. That is Zalitsky's discovery, which I've shown in this program. And the way that she describes it is, imagine a whole metropolitan city under there. That's off the western tip, basically San Antonio, Cuba. And those ruins are about 2,300 feet down, as opposed to some of the things that they discovered off Bimini, which were only about 20 feet underwater, the Bimini Wall. What Cayce was telling us was that this was part of a whole series of things that was going to happen there in the Hotzone relating to this. But he also said that in one of the temples that were under there are these, is the Hall of Records, which is something that contains this whole history of the Atlanteans. And so it would bring all that on board. Now, I think a lot about, and I've studied a lot about when King Tut, for example, was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, and how that really riveted the whole culture. And when that toured in the 1970s, toured all, you know, in the United States, if you go back and look at the culture, everything suddenly has King Tut in it. You know, they had songs, movies, all this stuff.
That's true. But even in the 1920s, when the first tour was going through, that actually spawned all this fashion revolution and in jewelry and in art.
Yes.
In a way, sort of, not Art Nouveau, but Art Deco is very Egyptian.
Yes,
so yeah,
absolutely.
There was a craze, but there's always a craze when when Egypt is around, right?
Yes,
People
absolutely.
can't help themselves. They're so enthusiastic.
Your Egyptian knowledge of cats is going to come in handy a little bit later here. That's really true, and I think what we have to keep in mind is the kind of earthquake that would happen when these ruins are discovered. So just taking the King Tut thing as an example, or when they found Nefertiti, just getting that idea that there was this advanced culture back there definitely would make a huge change in our discourse in society. That's the way I would look at it. And it has a powerful impact on the culture. There's no question about it. So that gives us kind of a context about why the Hotzone is so important. There may be more reasons. There may be mystical reasons. After all, it overlaps with the Bermuda Triangle. There may be magnetic current reasons, or what people call portals. And when we get into those things, we're dealing with a kind of cosmology about it. Those things are active in that area. Whatever it is we can say about this area, there's an incredible mystery that's emanating from it, that's drawn in people like Edgar Cayce, Ernest Hemingway, Martin Luther King, Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, you know, all these people around Bimini and all these people in relation to Cuba. And all with this, I would say, secret agenda to keep an eye on and to figure out where these ruins are. So the intrigue in the Hotzone is also a well-kept secret in intelligence circles. And, you know, when we went through Hemingway's history, Ernest Hemingway's history, spending so much time in Bimini and in Cuba. By the way, Ernest Hemingway makes a very interesting appearance in this episode, which you might find also interesting in terms of who he is the descendant of relating to the Salem witch trials. I mean...
You guys are not going to believe this. Is this going to be the TKO?
Well, it's one of them.
Okay.
It's definitely one of them. But I do feel that with this episode, we're going to get into a level of understanding about these things that's different. And this happens along the line as we do this show, that there's a pivotal accumulation of information which changes our perspective. And so that's what we're doing. So yeah, boy, it better be good, huh?
Yep.
After I said all that. So let's go back now to 1692, to the Salem witch trials. And, I've spent a little bit of time even working on a documentary about the Salem witch trials. And there are historical aspects which are fascinating, no question about it. And there's probably great people here who know a lot about the Salem witch trials. What intrigues me for this broadcast is the incredible crisscross of mystery school knowledge and connection with the Salem witch trial players, that is, even some of the judges involved, and their connection to this Hotzone activity. So that's where we're going to emphasize things tonight. But some of the kind of truly unusual things about this case involved spectral evidence being entered into the record. This is quite remarkable and shows that even with all of their superstitions and everything else that the Puritans came over here with, they had a great understanding in some other ways about astral activity. And all of the solid activity and evidence in the Salem witch trials wouldn't convict anybody. It was all this spectral evidence, which was, basically conjecture by the witnesses saying, well, so-and-so showed up in my dream and did X to me. So spectral evidence, I actually brought the definition of spectral evidence with me here, so we're going to get to that in just a moment. I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're plunging deep, deep, deep down into the Salem witch trials and its connection to the Hotzone, that area down there, between the Bahamas, Bimini, Cuba, and the Yucatan. Okay. One of the principal things that you notice about the Salem witch trials in the beginning is who is being afflicted. And so we're getting these girls who are being afflicted, and they kind of fall in line with this idea that I've mentioned before about the Orphic Circle. In the Orphic Circle, as we got from Emma Britton, who was in it, which is a cult society in the 19th century, they were using as somnambulist trance channels these girls who were about 10 to 14 years of age. I've seen this come up over and over again, and when we got into our Alice in Wonderland episodes, of course, we found out that Cayce, who was such a role model for Alice Adventures, Alice Through the Looking Glass, that she fell into this whole category as well. And so we see a lot of this activity in Alice in Wonderland, that somehow there's some kind of psychic overlay that is going on when we see these. The classic sort of image of the Salem witch trials and the strange things that were happening, if you go into those individual cases, you'll find not only were they afflicted with pain and pinching and screaming and hysteria and things like this, but they would also see lights before it would happen, indicating that they are getting some kind of contact from another dimension, or something is happening. We saw this a lot, of course, in the abduction phenomena with UFOs. The UFO abductors would show up, these lights would be there, and they take them through walls. This is not unlike some of the things that we see here in the Salem witch trials. If we follow that theme through books and through movies, and we've seen it quite a bit, we have quite an interesting roster of how they understand it. Of course, with Alice in Wonderland, she has to actually face off against very unusual things, like the Red Queen, for example, and things that really turn on her fast. Even the Cheshire Cat is kind of unusual in astral style. But again, when we consider the age range, it's interesting because secret societies and mystery schools understand the same things. The mystery schools trying to move the culture forward with these things. So a group like the Orphic Circle probably can contain both types, whereas the secret societies tend to try to take advantage of the psychic abilities. But this is a very interesting secret, I think, on the mystery school side, which is they're working with this younger psychic channels. Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz engaging with this. We have an archetype here of younger innocence using intuition and magic to overcome an established evil. And I think, you know, when we get along with it, we start to see that these writers and people who are giving us these stories are telling us more. Linda Blair in The Exorcist, when she is possessed by Pazuzu, it's interesting because she's largely unprotected and her mother is there and her mother can't seem to protect her. So we're seeing that these major movies coming through, giving us these types of things. Even The Exorcism of Emily Rose, she's a little bit older in that, but this idea of this female getting into trouble with these spectral influences and these exorcisms and things needing to happen is a major role, and there's certainly a long history of exorcism I won't get into here, but I think that we're getting into the idea that when someone is opened up to do these types of things, like Emma Britton discussing it in the Orphic Circle, that what's happening is she's going in and she has a set of rules about how to go into a trance state, etc. She's in a kind of protected state, and they're giving her questions and she's giving them information. But when someone is opened up to that activity without those types of protections, then they're anybody's game. And so when we're looking at the Salem witch trials, I think we're getting a hint that this is something of what happened, which is some of these girls literally are opening up. And I've heard a lot of things about the Salem witch trials in relation to is it ergot of the rye mold, and how this is actually how they make LSD and things like that. And I know that there have been cases in history, but I've studied that aspect of it completely, and there's almost no evidence, and I mean close to zero evidence, that there's anything like that involved.
Right. Well, you're just going to take a different approach.
Yes. Well, for my money, that just wasn't a factor, and I've looked at it. There's not enough consistency, and also a lot of times when these things are happening, they'll happen simultaneously at exactly the same time these girls are going into these hysterics. And then it seems like that is used to fuel a kind of feudal back and forth about how can we make so-and-so look bad, how can we take their land. And it all centers around, largely centers around a group called the Putnams down there, which are going to come in very interesting, along with William Stoughton, and who was the judge who actually wanted the really heavy penalties and the hangings and stuff, and he was just, hanging on by a thread. But we're going to find out about his true motivations. Now, when I mentioned the Hemingways, they do actually show up here, and we know how we've done all these episodes on the Hemingways in the Hotzone. Well, we're going to find out that the Hemingways were there in Salem under the name Hemingway, which is Hemenway, all under the generations of Ralph Hemingway, who was a wealthy landowner. And the 9th generation from Ralph Hemingway is Ernest Hemingway. But the 7th generation is Augustus Hemingway. And we're going to get into him because Augustus Hemingway was the richest man in the world.
Right, who the hell heard of him?
Who even knew? And what did he have? He had an incredible sugar plantation, and where was it?
I don't know.
In Cuba. So when we get Ernest Hemingway going to Cuba later, and they're all like, oh, he likes hard fishing and drinking and stuff like that. No, his relative was the richest man in the world and owned a huge plantation in Cuba. So let's, we're starting to get a better picture beyond the historical record. But if we're using the historical record to get that picture, so let's just say we're putting these things together.
I'm just sort of curious, when are you getting into the other relatives in that bloodline?
Oh yes. Well, they're coming up
Okay.
too. They're gonna be in this episode.
Okay.
All of them.
I'm not gonna let you forget.
Well, what's amazing about this is this could be an all-nighter, but I'm gonna condense it as best I can. So we've got Margot Hemingway. I want to point her out too because she was someone who pointed out that her family was under excessive pressure in relation to something, and she was walking in the footsteps of her grandfather to figure out what that was. Her dad was a CIA agent, and it seems to me that part of that pressure emanated from him. Mariel Hemingway talks a lot about this family pressure. And when we go far enough into their bloodline, we see it manifested. Even Augustus Hemingway, who I'm going to show tonight as that they were descendants from him, he had very unusual qualities, which is he actually went into a sanitarium for over a decade with these unusual manifestations of his mind. So Margot, at the end of her life, before she committed suicide in the 1990s, tragically, was actually working as a 1-900 psychic, dial a psychic type thing, and had spent all this time in India trying to figure out what was going on with her psychic abilities. So I think that this is going to come in handy the more we look into the Hemingways and get a kind of a snapshot of who they really are in relation to this. It makes a lot more sense, and their connection to the hot zone becomes incredibly obvious. Tonight is going to be very picture heavy because this is I've found some images that are going to inform the work that we're doing to such a high level and a high degree. So we're all going to be very lucky about that tonight. During the Salem witch trials, some of the things that came out when the first accusers were coming up were in relation to the servant of one of the people who was accused, and her name was Tituba. And Tituba was from Barbados, and she had, at a certain point, been showing some of the girls sort of occult tricks, things that they could do. Now, what's interesting is I've talked about some of these islands being famous for things like love potions and things like that. But there is this tradition there, and of course voodoo exists very heavily when you go into that area, when you're going into Haiti. So she was bringing over a lot of this influence, and if you look to her also, there's someone with her who's either her husband or her consort named Indian John, and he also has these unusual abilities. But they were scapegoated, and likely because they were foreign, and they were, she was made to confess doing all these things and to save her skin, and we see this a lot in these trials. However, we're going to find out that somebody who kind of set up the conditions for the Salem witch trials was also someone who was a governor of Barbados. And so the fact that she becomes the sort of ultimate witness, she's really the one that cracks the case because she gives adult testimony as opposed to these, teenagers. So this will get us kind of to start to understand, Barbados. Okay, Barbados is that interesting underpin of the Salem witch trials. We have a number of witch prosecutions and all the rest in Europe preceding this, which are very brutal and involve burning witches. And a lot of that was done for control. If you look on the mystery school side, you'll see people like Steiner said that the danger was that these groups who were keeping information and hoarding secret information, esoteric information, were very concerned that these witches had the psychic ability to tap into that information. And so they were doing a literal program of elimination, erase the database kind of elimination. So when we look at these tragic events that took place and the kind of persecutions that took place, a lot of it has to do, of course, with influence and just saying, that you want somebody to act a certain way, you have this tool. It's like the Inquisition. So we certainly had a lot of that in religious times. But I think when we look now back on it, we can also see another aspect and element through the lens of the mystery schools. And this leads me to Steiner's take on some of the events, along with Cayce's take. Now, I'm going to mention something about Edgar Cayce, which is quite unusual to me when I was studying his version of what happened during the Salem witch trials, which he did quite a few readings on. Well, that's because over 40 of the individuals involved in the Salem witch trials came to Cayce. They had had a previous life in Salem, and they came to Cayce for a life reading. So during his lifetime, 40 people associated with this. I found that quite remarkable. And many of his answers were very interesting as well, as he didn't suggest anything along the line of, that there was evil witches or anything like that. He actually was saying quite the opposite. He was saying that there were groups in that area who had the ability to bring through a kind of pure vision, and that they were persecuted by these overzealous authorities. And they had to actually reincarnate later in circumstances where they were subservient to the people that they had prosecuted. Quite remarkable as a sideline to all this. But I want to read a Rudolf Steiner quote about the nature of the kind of good and evil aspects going on here. And again, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I'm here with Olivia, and she is taking your questions for later in the second half of the program. We are going to be taking your questions, and you can ask them now. Ask them in all caps, because it makes it a heck of a lot easier when the time comes. And keep them show related in this, like X series related at least. And I'm very excited for that. It's a great, fantastic crowd tonight, and I see a lot of great familiar faces out there in the ideas room, and we'll be looking for your fantastic input. Okay, this is a Steiner quote relating to the general nature of the mystery schools and good and evil, and I think it's important. Black or gray magicians can gain possession of secrets. Such things have indeed been going on behind the scenes of external events during the current decades. Politically, he's talking around World War I. Certain circles in this materialistic age are striving to paralyze and make impossible all of humanity's spiritual development. Think of that. I mean, if we really, really think of that, there are certain groups that they're trying to make it impossible for humanity to spiritually develop. Quote, "For our earth is a battlefield. It is the scene of two opposing powers, right and left. The one, the white power on the right, after the earth has reached a certain degree of material physical density, strives to spiritualize it once again. The other, the denser, like the moon. Thus, after a period of time, the earth could become the physical expression for the good powers or the physical expression for the evil. It becomes the physical expression for the good powers through man uniting himself with the spirits working for unification, in that he seeks the ego in community. It belongs to the function of the earth to differentiate itself physically to an even greater degree." This is Rudolf Steiner, the leader of anthroposophy and spiritual science, which is really largely a public mystery school. Now, it is possible for the separate parts to go their own way and for each part to form an ego. This is the black path. The white path is the one which strives for what is common, which forms an ego in community. Were we to burrow more and more deeply into ourselves, to sink into ourselves and our own ego organization, to desire always more and more for ourselves, the final result would be that we should strive to separate ourselves from one another. If, on the other hand, we draw closer so that a common spirit inspires us, so that a center is formed between us in our midst, then we are drawn together, then we are united. There are black adepts who are on the way to acquiring certain forces of the earth for themselves. Were the circle of their pupils to become so strong that this should prove possible, then the earth would be on the path leading to destruction, unquote. So this is Rudolf Steiner giving us his odds, basically. With Steiner, he's saying it's not a guarantee that the good forces win. It's a battle. And that the way that he sees it is the struggle is going to be against humanity versus what he calls Ahriman, which are these Ahrimanic powers. So when we see the roots of this in the Salem witch trials, we're dealing with people's superstitions, one, about witchcraft and the paranoia and fear and excessive religiosity, on one hand. But then on the other hand, we're also looking at groups playing out battles. And that's why this is going to be so crucial when we look at some of the players behind who set up the Salem witch trials in the first place. And that's where Steiner's take on the mystery schools influencing the politics and the situations of the day certainly help. Those aspects, according to him, will rise into an immense war in the 21st century that we're in right now. So this is apparently a great deal of what we're looking at with the transhumanist movement. Yes, Ms.
I
Olivia.
have somebody in the ideas room who is asking a very provocative question, and I just want to throw it at you.
Yes, oh yeah.
Okay. So Eric Tecci of Waking Magic says, DJ, let's explore the community at hand rather than what was. Such past figures made their mark for others to go beyond. What would you say to that?
The community at hand. Well, if you don't understand the history of it, then you won't get very far. That's why the adepts have a history and kept a history for us. That's why the mystery schools exist. So, when you look at the life of Jesus or the life of Buddha, it creates a pattern. And so the pattern lives. It reanimates in different times. But you can't go and say, well, it was great, John F. Kennedy was great, or whatever, but we really shouldn't think about his presidency because it's not in the 21st century. No, it's the pattern of service. This is why it's a creation of archetypes. So when we look at King Arthur, and when we look at these things, they are constructs, they're archetypes in our unconscious psyche, which is if we understand them and adopt their patterns of growth and understanding. So if we get locked into a news cycle, where you just have to be hopping on, what did Trump tweet today and Lindsey Graham insulted him, it gets tricky. So I think that the possibilities exist that when you look at events that have taken place, you see them as patterns that come around over and over again for humanity to gain an incredible lesson. But in terms of the mystery schools, their activity has been largely masked. And one of the things that we do on this program through using the exsteganography is we're starting to open up chapters that weren't there. And I compare it to the Rosetta Stone, and it's not hubris because with the Rosetta Stone, before they found the Rosetta Stone in 1799, and they didn't interpret it till about 1820. And what happens is suddenly all that stuff they were looking at in Egypt and all those hieroglyphs come to life because they're able to crack the code with the Rosetta Stone. If they didn't have it, then Egypt was just a bunch of nice pictures. So, fundamentally, our lives are a chain. And so we're connected all the way back to Atlantis and the conflagration that took place there, as well as Apotheum and the effect that the mystery schools represented by using things like exsteganography and symbolism. So I think, we gain a great deal more.
Yeah, I mean, the simpler answer is that we are like a tree, and we need strong roots. We need to be, and we are beings that live in time, and our history, our past, our ancestry is our roots, and identity is important.
Yeah, I mean, and when you think about the Salem witch trials, and the reason that they are. You know, it's funny because Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible about the Salem witch trials when McCarthyism was happening, and all these writers were getting blacklisted. The pattern was still there, and the term witch hunt that came up in relation to everyone being called a communist, which they try to do with the alternative media during the Trump election with the whole Russia, Russia collusion thing. And regardless of your political affiliation, everyone has to know that that was a crock. And they were trying to use that to go after people in the alternative media to say, hey, you must be Russia influenced if you don't like the Democrats. So we can see that these patterns, the Salem witch patterns, the McCarthyism, it's as alive as Russian collusion. And what are they going to come up with next? That spirit is always there. But it is interesting, I get a great deal from studying history because I feel like the history informs what's happening in the present. And if you don't understand that, then you won't understand it'll be like your enemy is invisible. That's one of the toughest ones. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here in episode X67. This is the Salem witch trials and its connection to the occult mystery in the hot zone. The two of them go together, and I'm going to bring some of this evidence forward shortly here. I am joined by the lovely Olivia, and we are taking your questions in the second half of the program. I love that interaction with you guys, and I have to say, in terms of the ideas room, it's incredible, for me, the kinds of ideas that I hear circulating around in there. So I'll never call it the chat as long as as long as I do it. And it's nice. It seems like it's very troll free tonight as well.
Almost.
Almost. That's good. Just to let everyone know, we have a new nickname for trolls now. We've decided not to use the term troll anymore. We're going to use the term sucka MC. Whenever someone's out of line, we're just going to say, it's sucka MC. And I think that's actually going to make things go a little bit better. Because every time the troll shows up, it's going to put a smile on her face. Because really, they're just sucka MCs, So just wait for the next TTSA show. I'm going to be using that term a lot. And I want to remind everyone to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for the newsletter. Look, they are, wholesale grabbing content creators and news shows and all the rest of it that they don't like. Right, left, indifferent. Just the ones who don't toe the party line, and they're just throwing them off social media or shadow banning them or whatever. Now, it is true, you won't hear me complain about this kind of thing a lot, but we do experience it, and I don't want to be somebody out there saying like, they're slowing down my internet feed. But the fact of it is that they do that, but you won't hear me say it a lot. So the best way to avoid, missing out on this content is to sign up for the newsletter. It's free. You get one every Friday. It lets you know who the guests are and the incredible shows that we have coming up for you this fall, which are going to be extraordinary, and some very important live events that we are going to announce. You want to be on that newsletter. For that, while you're there, subscribe to the site, get on board, and get behind the site by becoming a regular subscriber and getting access to that level. We're going to be doing a lot more for subscribers, including some very important things that are happening in October, which we will be talking about. Okay. I'm going to jump into Andros.
Go for it.
It sounds like I'm going to take a swim. See how this all works? Many of you who watch this program know that I spend a lot of time on Bimini, and across from it is the largest island in the Bahamas, which is called Andros Island. Now, part of the most important underwater finds for archaeological reasons is something called the Andros Platform, which rivals the Bimini Wall in that it's quite intricate and was definitely carved by an advanced culture. And we need to, we've been looking more and more, the people who are researching this, going more and more, finding out, is there anything around the Andros Platform? The other interesting thing I'll say about Andros is that AUTEC is there. And AUTEC is basically, let's just think of that as the underwater Area 51, where they do all these secret experiments and they're working with some very, very unusual things. There was a whistleblower who came out of AUTEC and talked about how he was doing the radar there off of Andros, and out of nowhere, a large landmass appeared. It wasn't a ship, it wasn't a submarine, it was a landmass appeared on his radar. And he called his superiors over, etc. He was trying to get someone else to look at this with him. And they seemed very shocked also. But, so this thing kind of appeared for a while and then disappeared. So, might give us an idea of some of the other things that they're tracking there in the hot zone in relation to all this, which is, what is it exactly that's happening? Are there land masses that are appearing and disappearing, as he saw? A number of people who spend time over by, or going by, taking a look at this, because AUTEX stretches out between Florida and Cuba on Andros Island. They say, they see the things that people around Area 51 see, which are strange lights, and there's a series of sightings associated with the island. Now, the island has an unusual enough history, as does Bimini. But one of the key things about Andros is it's right there in that spot for where Cayce had said, follow in the Gulf Stream. Basically, you'll find the hot zone ruins. So I started to wonder a little bit about the origin of names. And there's a British intelligence officer named Edgar Sykes who gives us the origin of Bimini's name, tying it into the Bennu bird in Egypt. And he explores how these Egyptian travelers were associated with the culture that was there, which he doesn't call Atlantis, he calls Murias, there in that area of Bimini, drawing on Celtic legends. But in terms of Andros, it was a little bit different. Andros was actually named after a figure who was associated with all of this hubbub around the Salem witch trials. This guy's name is Edmund Andros, and he's going to become very important here. He was a very, very controversial governor in Massachusetts in the period just
and this is no overstatement.
Well, this guy was driven out, and it seemed like he's driven out wherever he goes.
Do you have that picture?
I do indeed. This is him. Well, I guess we're jumping to the end of the story, but that's him being driven out of Boston when the mad mob was just like, we've had enough of you, you're weird taxing, throwing people off land, etc. Just get out of here. Andros is a very important figure, but mostly because, for starters, Andros Island is named after him. Because this is somebody who basically, like Henry Morgan, had a lot of control there in the hot zone. Now, Edmund Andros will be the person who sets up William Stoughton. Now, Stoughton is a city. How far is Stoughton from here?
It's probably 30 minutes in the opposite direction.
It's about a half hour, yeah. It's named after William Stoughton, and we're going to watch now how William Stoughton is the main influence behind the Salem witch trials. And his association with Andros is quite fascinating when we peel back the layers and start to see who the real connections are that set up this whole event, because it was very structured and not as spontaneous as it appeared. But let's get a little history on Andros. Sir Edmund Andros, born in December 1637, died in 1714. He was an English colonial administrator in North America as the governor of the Dominion of New England during most of its 3-year existence. At other times, Andros served as the governor of New York, East and West Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland. So basically, this is a guy who the crown in England just installs. They're like, put him up there and he's the governor. You have to do what he says. And they move him around on the board. Oddly enough, he was remarkably unpopular. As I just showed in Boston, he was actually driven out. And, he escapes to Rhode Island, and they grab him again. And they basically barely save him from getting lynched. Because he was just so unpopular with his kind of fascist tactics. Now, despite his enemies, he managed to negotiate several treaties of the covenant chain with the Iroquois. Now, this is very interesting. The Iroquois Indians are a tribe that was able we were able to get so many constitutional virtues from that the Founding Fathers gave their Confederation of States as a kind of a model, a blueprint for how we put together our original setup of the 13 states. One of the interesting things that happened was I was going through some material in the Cayce readings relating to the Iroquois, is that Cayce said that they were the closest to the full-blooded Atlantean strain of those who, after Atlantis went down, came to America and started. We know that some of them went to Mexico, some of them went south to South America, some of them went to Egypt, etc. But he said that it was the Iroquois who maintained the actual bloodline. Keep that in mind, as Andros will associate himself for many years with the Iroquois. And so it jumped out at me very interestingly right off the bat that here we have him dealing with a group that, according to Cayce, is the full-blooded Atlanteans with that history intact as the natives had it. And then I'm starting to look at his unusual activities in relation to the hot zone, and now here he is showing up in the middle of appointing William Stoughton, who will run the Salem witch trials. Starts to get you interested as to what's going on here. The connections that start to open up. Okay. Now this is interesting. He married Mary Craven, the daughter of Thomas Craven of Burnsall, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, the son of a cousin to the Earl of Craven, one of his closest advisors. The Cravens would run the Bahamas. And so he's now married directly to the daughter, Mary Craven. Now here's another interesting thing. He was commissioned major in the regiment of Sir Tobias Bridge. He was sent to Barbados in 1666. And he was there for 2 years. Now it's very interesting when you look at the Salem witch trials, because we get into this, when we mentioned earlier that Tituba is such a crucial factor on the evidence front. They can't really do anything without her testimony of saying, yes, all this witch stuff happened. And that she was part of it because she knew all of these unusual mystical things from Barbados. So let's just kind of keep that in mind as we move along here. He remained a firm supporter of the Stuarts while they were in exile. Charles, too, after his restoration to the throne, specifically commended the Andros family for its support. This is very important because they were extremely unpopular, and like him. And so, but they were setting him up in such a way, and he was showing his loyalty. So what happens as we go along here is that he travels into Iroquois country to establish relations there. He's one of the first major points of contact. And they have dealt with some Dutch, and he also becomes an administrator of New Amsterdam, which we've shown New Amsterdam, which is New York City in the main. New Amsterdam has a very interesting logo when they come over here, their seal of those 3 X's, which is quite remarkable. But the person that he helps out through all this is William Stoughton. And as a matter of fact, Stoughton later regrets being associated with him because he almost gets run out of town himself. Now, William Stoughton, as we're going to see here, on those warrants that he sends out to all of those, in quotes, witches, he puts a very interesting seal on each one of the warrants. And that's his seal, which I think we can witness there is definitely just basically an X inside of a badge. It's hardcore. This is a more close-up shot of it, but we're instantly getting now into X-steganography inside of the Salem witch trials. The warrants for each one of the people accused of witchcraft carry Stoughton's seal on each and every one. So the X-steganography, they're giving themselves away here. But let's see how Stoughton comes into the picture, because Stoughton himself, I believe, is such a principal figure that when the other, when they've had enough of the hangings and they've hanged 19 witches and crushed the life out of one other one, he still wants more. And when they shut it down and it's become this, fiasco and this horrible tragedy, he writes this big thing saying, God will curse this land. And he goes on this big tirade because he wants to do more of this. And we have to wonder what's going on with Mr. Stoughton. Okay, let's get a little background influence. Also, what's very important is, and this is crucial for understanding the relationship of the Salem witch trials to the mystery school waves and the fights that are going on there, the tensions behind the scenes in those secret societies, because he allows something called spectral evidence. Now, that's the first time that it's allowed in America, and eventually they will kick it out because it basically is, I saw so-and-so on the astral plane, they did something to me. And that's allowed as evidence. If it's not, by the way, all of those cases will be thrown out. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The testimony, nothing works without the spectral evidence, which also suggests a large-scale understanding of mystery techniques. It's not just a superstitious, I saw a ghost. It is, a ghost did something to me in dream time, showed up and did this, showed me these symbols, etc., etc. So they start to reveal in certain ways that they know a lot.
So it's basically hearsay, right? And it's completely subjective. So you can't prove it.
Exactly. And the other judges talking to him, if you go back and read some of those transcripts, they're like, you're never going to get any convictions on any of these people. And they can't even get them into the court without Tituba's saying, yes, I have had some consorting with spirits kind of thing. But let's go a little bit deeper. Stoughton was in charge of what have come to be known the Salem witch trials as Chief Justice of the Special Court and then as the Chief Justice of the Superior Court. He's the one. There's no question about it. Now I have here evidence against Stoughton that it is in fact our friend Sir Edmund Andros, as the governor of New England, who sets him up because he leaves as governor in 1689, 3 years before the Salem witch trials. He's the guy who installs him and gives him carte blanche. Now, he has other friends, yes, but it's his relationship with Andros that really gets him in good. And here in the record, going through the history of Andros and Stoughton, it says the council that Andros nominated was Joseph Dudley, William Stoughton, Robert Mason, Thomas Hinckley. It's an interesting name, and so on. So, but he is setting him up, okay, and that is in 1886. Okay, so that is significantly before the witch trials happened, some 6 years later. His close association gets him in. This is what positions him to be able to do this. Let's go a little further. In these trials, he controversially accepted spectral evidence based on supposed demonic visions. This is actually part of his legacy because none of these other judges could even believe that he did that. It's very interesting that he did, though, and I'm going to get into why. After graduating from Harvard College in 1650, about 5 or 6 minutes from here, he continued religious studies in England, where he also preached. A great guy. Returning to Massachusetts in 1662, he chose to enter politics. Okay, an adept politician, he served in virtually every government through the period of turmoil in Massachusetts that encompassed the revoking of its first charter in 1684 and the introduction of a second charter in 1692, including the unpopular rule of Sir Edmund Andros in the late 1680s. Their close association almost doomed him, but instead, what happened was the whole process gets saved through England. So why did they want Stoughton there, and why was it Andros who set him up? And remember, Andros is who they named Andros Island across from Bimini Island from. Well, it's going to make sense before the episode is over, that's for sure. Are you with me, Olivia?
I guess so, yes. I think I'm trying to follow all this. Mm-hmm.
So far, so good. So all you have to really keep in mind, Stoughton.
Mm-hmm. And he's kind of a proxy for Andros, right?
He is. He's basically his protege.
Okay.
And Stoughton is the Salem witch trials. He's the one who gets the convictions for the hanging. He's the one who won't let it go. As a matter of fact, what he's best known for is when they're going to let one of the witches, quote unquote, go, he urges them to go back and reconsider the jury. He's saying, no, go back. You've made your decision, but go back and consider it again. And they're like, oh, they go back and then decide that she's guilty. And he's like, oh, what a relief, we get to hang her. So this guy has it out for these witches, and the question becomes, why? Aside from, there's plenty of religious zealotry going on there, but they don't want to hang these people. He does. So let's start to think about what's going on with him. And of course, they wound up naming Stoughton after him, which I find quite fascinating. Now, remember that I said that Andros got thrown out, and they thought that the colonists thought that this guy is a traitor. Listen to what they have to say about Stoughton. In the 1684 election for the New England Confederation, Boston and Salem, and Cambridge and Dorchester, Joseph Dudley, who had been labeled an enemy of the colony, along with Stoughton and others. Again, we have an enemy of the colony here. Andros is an enemy of the colony, and now Stoughton, who picks up where he left off, he's also being denounced as an enemy.
By the masses? By the peasantry?
By the colonists themselves. Yeah, they're like, we need to get this guy out of here.
Because?
It's very interesting. Let's get into why both look, when they took Andros out, they took him out by bayonet. I mean, they wanted to get rid of him. And I can't say that I blame them. So what happens is they tie him a lot to Charles II, which we find quite fascinating in relation to the fact that Charles II shows up for Andros, shows up for Stoughton. This is basically, if you want to talk about a cabal, this is a cabal to look at. Charles II behind the scenes working with these two. During the administration of Sir Edmund Andros, Stoughton served as a magistrate and on the council as a magistrate. He was particularly harsh on the town leaders of Ipswich, who had organized tax protests against the Dominion government based on the claim that Dominion rule without representation violated the rights of Englishmen. This is the cornerstone of how we get the American Revolution less than 100 years later. So
it's actually the roots of the American Revolution are right there. The seeds of the
American Revolution are right here when he's going in and saying, we want to tax you for this, tax you twice for that, and you can't use this land, you can use that land, etc. And they are doing the protests, and he's like, you have to do the smackdown. So he is the agent of the crown here. It's good to keep that in mind. When Andros was arrested in 1689, that's less than 3 years before the Salem witch trials, in a bloodless uprising inspired by the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England, Stoughton was one of the signatories on the declaration for the revolt's ringleaders. Despite the statement of support for the popular cause, he was sufficiently unpopular due to his association with Andros, and he was denied elective office. His ties to this kind of fascist dictator who rolls in. And Andros is very strange, I have to say, when we look into his history. He's married 3 times but has no children. He is excessively unpopular because of his fascist style techniques. He's like a dictator when he rolls into these places. And he's completely unfair, and he always gets thrown out. And, oddly enough, he has an incredible obsession with securing peace with the Iroquois. And he has been through Barbados, and he's ruled parts of the Bahamas, and they named Andros Island after him. When you put these things together, we start to get a picture of Andros as a real key player in this setup. But Stoughton is the front man. He's the person who has to go forward and make the Salem witch trials happen. Why? Why is he so obsessed with this? As I said, religious zealotry existed, no question. But even those judges thought he was way over the top. And when he wouldn't go any further, he gave the statement basically damning them. I can tell you right now that Stoughton was an agent who was trying to prevent some of the colonists from developing this ability, which was going to put them in touch with larger mystery schools. And this battle that takes place is a political battle where Charles II is sending them in to make sure that this is curtailed. They didn't have this kind of stuff in Massachusetts. Interestingly enough, you will find that a witch was hanged under Andros's rule, which is very unusual in the records at that time. So we're seeing there that Andros and Stoughton bring this in, and it looks like Andros actually has a trial run for this. Okay, let's keep rolling. Also, when we get into Cotton Mather and all those people, Mather will become the main figure in sort of driving the story of the Salem witch trials, and he'll write about it later. And his brother is the president at Harvard, and Harvard comes into this story a lot. Too close for comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here now on the Salem witch trials and the kind of geopolitical mystery school background of how this happened in the first place. We're going to address some of the incidents about the trials and the spectral evidence aspect, which I think is important because, you know, when we talk on this program about Ex Protect, we've talked about something called an astral agency, which is where things like the Men in Black come from. And they have unusual abilities, which is they show up and then they disappear. They are, in fact, spectral. But I think that the use of spectral evidence in the Salem witch trials is a dead giveaway that these are people who understand those rules of engagement. And so, you know, they couldn't find them just as, let's plant some evidence on them as witches. They had to introduce this spectral evidence aspect. It's going to become very crucial before we're done here. Now, so a new governor gets in, Phipps, after Andros, and this is, as soon as he gets in, Phipps is very interesting too. Phipps immediately appoints Stoughton to head a special tribunal to deal with the accusations of witchcraft. So he's set up by Andros, and then Phipps gets in and makes him the thing to go after them. I do feel that it's Andros who gives him the real leg up, and it's Charles II working both of these guys behind the scenes. Phipps looks to me like a puppet, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him. But I think it is important that he makes him not just a judge, but the Chief Justice of Colonial Courts. And he would hold the post for the rest of his life. So he's being given carte blanche, but like, hey, you got to go in there and do this job and get rid of this, and so they don't ever try it again. So basically, frame them. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for why the Salem witch trials happen. Like I said, I don't think it has anything to do with, you know, bread mold or anything like that. It's actually a very deep political situation. There were a lot of political tensions. If you look at the logs of people who were sending reports back to England at the time, they will say this is a very quarrelsome part of the colony. And that whole Salem village, which encompasses a lot of territory, they weren't getting along, and they argued over territory, and there were kind of small fiefdoms all the way through it. There's a group in there called the Putnams, which caused the most trouble in terms of the Salem witch trials, from what I can see. And there's over 100 accusations by them against witches. So there's something, certainly there are scores that they're trying to settle there, and they also are trying to introduce this idea of building a church. And they want to build it right in Salem, but the parishioners don't want to pay twice the taxes there, the people who live there. And they say, no, we'll just go 5 miles down there. We have a big church down there. We're all set. And this is what's really ticking off the Putnams at the time, because they're not able to get that money for Charles II. So we're looking at a kind of a complex geopolitical situation, no question. However, when we bring in the occult aspects, we're starting to see that when we look at, for example, the Cayce readings, he's saying what's happening with some of the people in Salem at that time is they are getting higher visions. That is, instead of it being of the devil and all this other stuff, it's that they're manifesting psychic ability. And that this becomes the word, and this becomes the thing that needs to be blocked and turned into this whole scandal, and that they're working with the devil and consorting with the devil. Somehow, the understanding that there were advanced girls in the colony who had this psychic ability, and it was going to interface the colony with mystery schools. And this is thwarted as we move along here. This is the next thing.
This is very intriguing. I didn't know this is where we were going tonight.
So far, so good.
Do you think this was partly a function of coming to the new world and the new freedoms, and including there was an instinct for the girls, for women, to become liberated to a certain extent from being out of their native culture in England, and they were starting to kind of express themselves in new ways, and they had to. Yes. I'm thinking of being like a feminist here, that they had to be squashed, that instinct.
No question, no question. Although think about, basically what you learn when you look back at that period is that women and children are basically slaves. And in terms of rights, forget it. I do think we need to look a little bit deeper when we look at the Salem witch trials. There's the cover story and there's the tragedy of it, and there certainly is the traditional story that stands on its own. What I'm finding, though, if you also look at these colonists, they're interacting with Native American cultures, and the Native American cultures have a very deep sense of spiritualism themselves, and some of the more peaceful tribes that they're interacting with, they're learning a great deal. And the idea that gets put across about Tituba teaching these kind of occult things from Barbados is interesting too, because we know when we deal with voodoo and when we deal with those issues, it's like the reverse spirituality. So there was like an emerging understanding, just like what would happen when you get to the Fox sisters in 1848. They start the spiritualist craze. Why? Because they start doing table rappings and seances and things like that. Well, then the culture's ready for it. There's still people who want to burn them at the stake, I'm sure, but it's a free enough culture that this gets brought forward and the mystery schools assisted. What's going on here in 1692 is there's some kind of spontaneous awakening going on psychically among people in the colonies. And somehow there's a feeling inside, if you really look at the excessive zeal, with they're rooting this out, it has something to do with who's going to have the upper hands here, the secret societies that are forming this or the mystery schools who are trying to move a genuine culture forward. I'm going to be able to display this battle a little bit closer as we look a little bit more at William Stoughton. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep into the Salem Witch Trials Hotzone Occult mystery. And what we're finding is that the people who are the main antagonists for the witch trials and accusers and all the rest of it, and how they use people in the colonies to fight, are tools of Charles II in England, and he's largely unpopular. And they, when they come here, using their techniques, are so unpopular, it's almost supernatural, the way that people go after them and know that they need to kind of get rid of them. In the case of Andros, this was pretty wild. An armed mob taking him, who's the governor, and just trading him back to England. It's quite remarkable. But of course, they do something, they try to do something similar with Stoughton. Okay. And also the fact, I do want to say that they could also have been looking at the situation as a real lockdown, because if they are having tax protests, and they're looking in the future and saying, the American Revolution is on the horizon, and we know the mystery schools are very deeply involved in creating the Constitution and founding the nation. So there's a battle going on here in the early periods that I think we need to take a good look at. Now, this just for his character profile, I do want to say this. In the now notorious Salem witch trials, Stoughton acted as both chief judge and prosecutor. So he had to be a lock. He's chief judge and prosecutor. So that way, whoever else could be in that spot can't disagree with him. So they give him. This is kind
That's
of like.
That's crazy. That's kangaroo court.
It is. Well, when you think about Hitler, he installed himself as chancellor. Mm-hmm. And he also installed himself, it was like, I'm chancellor and president, so there can't be somebody else who's there who will oppose me. And that's, that's the kind of power consolidation that we see as a pattern. So he was particularly harsh on some of the defendants, sending the jury deliberating in the case of Rebecca Nurse back to reconsider its not guilty verdict, as I mentioned. It's pretty hardcore. After doing so, she was convicted. So he actually was like, you got to make this happen. Many convictions were made because Stoughton permitted the use of spectral evidence. There it is again. The idea that a demonic vision could not only take on the shape or appearance of someone who had some sort of devilish pact or engaged in witchcraft. Cotton Mather, who was kind of the religious authority of the time, argued that this type of evidence wasn't acceptable. And the judges expressed reservations about it. And during all this, when he sends out all the warrants, he's with the X-steganography. So something's going on here where he's hungry like the wolf. And he's moving things down faster and harder than all these other judges who are also religiously conservative, etc. Why? Well, we're going to find out.
How are you sure that this isn't just him being a psychopath or a sociopath or a sadist?
Certainly. I did consider, well, he has to have some of those qualities. There's no question about it. But the question is, why is he, just like Andros, installed to these incredibly...
In that position.
Yeah. It goes a little bit deeper than, he's a Captain Queeg type psychopath, and he's being moved into position to do things and act out and get something done. And if he can get it, then he gets incredible rewards, which is why he won't back off. So there's this whole thing about how he, tried to, during when the pressure was easing off on the witch hunt and they decided to end the trials, he keeps on this campaign, we have to make this happen. And they basically, even the most far out judges are like, we're not dealing with this guy on this. So now we have Andros and Stoughton. And Andros has a major connection to the Hotzone. Now, one of the things we brought up on the program recently was about John King, a.k.a. Henry Morgan, who was this famous pirate. And Morgan shows up as an unusual figure during this whole explosion of mystery school activity in the mid-19th century, because he keeps showing up in these spiritualist circles, identifying himself and saying this is what the spirit world is all about, including the fact that he becomes the main guide for Helena Blavatsky, according to her own testimony to Henry Alcott, her partner in the Theosophical Society. When we look at this period of time, remember that Rudolf Steiner has given us a snapshot. He said that when we got into 1840, that the scientific materialism that was coming out of Germany was impacting the culture as such that there were those inside of the mystery schools who understood that within 100 years, humanity would not be recognizable, because they were reducing it. Scientific materialism is different than just scientism. It reduces everything to data collection. And so it won't allow for any other possibilities. It's actually not even celebrated among most scientists. It's a very deliberate kind of... I think the way to look at it is it takes all of the spiritual life and crushes it out of everything and just makes everything basically what can be measured can be proved. Now, we all know, and we're thankful for general scientific principles, But we've had people come forward, like Tesla, for example, who was incredibly scientific, but also knew the incredible kind of spiritual significance behind the things that he was seeing. And we know that he was inspired, and many were inspired by Goethe, who was basically the ultimate kind of scientist, philosopher, poet, which is what those guys were in those days. So, but when we look at what the mystery schools were allowing out at that point, a lot of it has to do with information relating to life after death, information relating to psychic activity, information relating to, psychic diagnosis. So there's a whole thing that comes out there in this period as a reaction against this incredible scientific materialism, which is bearing down on the culture and which is we have the fruits of now. But side by side with it, we have the mystery school parallel line, which has given us what? A sense of spiritual understanding. It's given us a sense that, hey, there's a higher thing. There's information from these mystery schools. There's a past culture in Atlantis. There's all these things that we've learned, and which really exploded, I think, if you look at it, in the 1960s and 70s. And that includes reincarnation, ESP, life after death, and all the rest of it. Well, if you look back before that, there's understandings about things, but there's not much of a public discourse about it. It's kept behind that wall of secrecy, and if you talk about it, you might end up like some of these accused witches in Salem. So we take it based on Steiner's and some others' testimony that the mystery schools had made this decision to release these things out to the public. However, there's a risk, because when they do that, the possibility that the information that they're sharing will get abused by people who aren't ready for it or people who would abuse it. So it's not a very cut and dry situation. They really have to be careful about how they do it. Now, there are a lot of fits and starts when this goes on. For example, some of the activity that you see in the Salem witch trials talked about, all of these kind of specters and seeing things. When this reemerges through things like the Fox sisters communicating with the spiritual world, by the time you get to Helena Blavatsky in 1875, announcing the creation of the Theosophical Society with Emma Hardinge Britton and Henry Alcott, they are, the society has moved sufficiently in 200 years to be able to allow a real discourse about this. Isis Unveiled would have, they would have hanged Blavatsky for putting that out in 1693, there's no question about it. So we can see that the timing was right and the mystery schools had decided this is what's going to happen. But this battle and its relation to the hot zone becomes more and more compelling when we look at the backgrounds of people associated with the hot zone. So now we're going to go into the Hemingways and their association with the background of the Salem witch trials and with the history of the archaeology leading to the hot zone and their association with Edgar Cayce. And before we do that, Miss Olivia.
I had a question.
Yes.
Wasn't Blavatsky a witch in a former life? Hadn't she been killed by the Inquisition or something like that?
Well, it's interesting. We should know more about Blavatsky's former lives, but there was a comment that Steiner made that she had a distortion in relation to Christianity, as Annie Besant did, from being persecuted by it. Now, Annie Besant, we know at the end of her life, it was revealed that she was Giordano Bruno, who basically, his astronomy got him into deep trouble with the church. And all his mystical ideas did as well, and they eventually burnt him at the stake. And Besant, when she was reincarnated as the leader of Theosophy, she carried all that. And so they both had kind of a disposition against this really harsh Christianity, which, as we know...
I don't even think you need to be... you don't need to perceive it as harsh, per se. My mother... Yes. is a horrible atheist, but she loves plants. She's definitely a green witch, and but when she was very young, decided that she wanted to have nothing to do with anything Christian. And my theory is that she was persecuted and possibly killed as a witch, And because her feelings about it were so primal for a child, to express, she knew right away this was not for her, and she never looked back.
There's an incredible, it's fascinating. There's a remarkable book based on the Edgar Cayce readings called Scars of the Soul, which are all about these various maladies that people came back with, or dispositions based on their previous lives. And it was quite amazing, some of the people who were there during the Christians and the Lions, and watching that and enjoying it, came back with different types of neurotic tendencies and qualities and illnesses. And it's quite interesting to see how this plays out as a pattern. Once we get, this is another gift from the mystery schools, which is giving us an idea that one existence isn't it. So not saying that you need to believe in reincarnation to believe in the mystery schools and the legacy that they have, but it's a key tenet of the information I think that they've let out to the public. Speaking of just kind of mothers and witchcraft and such, this is a little known fact. Speaking of, since we mentioned Giordano Bruno, this is Johannes Kepler. And Kepler defended his mother in a witchcraft trial. The famous astronomer conducted his mother's defense in an ordeal that lasted 6 years. This is a very interesting story. If you follow it up, it's in Airspace magazine here, but it's dealt with in his biographies. And Kepler's a very fascinating astronomer, but he worked out the laws of planetary motion, one of the great achievements of Renaissance science. Now, in this article, it says, he became embroiled in his middle age in a battle between reason and superstition. It wasn't his own ideas that were on trial. And it goes in here that in 1615, 24 witnesses accused his mother of being a witch. The evidence, she magically appeared through closed doors, paralyzed the schoolmaster with a drink of wine, hit a young girl on the arm, causing inhuman pain. That's interesting. Even Katerina's son Heinrich claimed that she had ridden the calf to death and prepared him a roast dish from it. So, just incredible, like really bizarre
Weird
accusations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And her son Heinrich, who I guess is Johannes's brother, he himself wanted to accuse her before the authorities. Because of these charges and others, the elderly Katerina was chained to the floor of a prison cell where she was watched by 2 guards. 1615 now. This is some 80 years, just a little shy, about 75 years before the Salem witch trials. Europe was so ahead of us. Kepler, then the imperial mathematician for the Emperor Rudolf II, took over his mother's legal defense, not realizing the case would go on for 6 years. And he finally gets her off. And then she dies 6 months later anyway from having gone through the whole thing. But we get kind of a sense here that this witchcraft and using it as a tool to prosecute somebody. Now, there were many, many opponents of Kepler and the things he was discovering because they felt it was giving secrets away, or because they felt that the church was losing power because he was discovering through astronomy that, hey, things aren't as you guys told us. So they were using witchcraft here as a tool, as a battering ram, in order to keep people down, and that's what we see is inherited by the time we get to the Salem witch trials. What's fascinating is this. In 1609, Kepler wrote what would eventually be published as Somnium, the Dream. The book's preface combined real and imagined elements, including a narrator whose mother is a witch who consults him with a demon to learn how to travel to the moon.
Mm.
I instantly just started thinking of Jack Parsons and the whole weirdness. There is an occult aspect whenever you get around space travel. And here's Kepler, the man who basically gave us the understanding of how the planets rotated in the first place. And he's writing a book about the occult science of getting to the moon. I found it absolutely fascinating. Now, later, he had to say in court, that book has nothing to do with my mother. So we can see that they were using and manipulating people in different ways in order to, one, keep that information down, and two, to really kind of create this atmosphere of fear And it worked incredibly well. By the time you get to Salem, which is like a breakaway colony, then they're maintaining and creating a new culture. It's like they've found the whole new Atlantis, which is Sir Francis Bacon's dream, which is 1520. Hey, everyone go to America. But when they get there, it kind of becomes everybody's territory. The group there is free of this oversight of the persecution of the Church of England, but at the same time they encounter all these different issues. And what starts to happen outside of this, because they're kind of mavericks and they're not under that control, it's sort of like the Wild West, that they can sort of develop their own roles. And we see what happens in Salem, if we look at Cayce's readings and to some extent Steiner's work, is that they're getting in touch directly with the spiritual world. And this is a spontaneous thing that's happening among certain members. And so this process has to be shut down by these authorities, and they also will use it to settle some situations, including this Putnam situation. So I mentioned that the Putnams come up over and over again prosecuting people, including 108 accusations against different people. Well, I've got something very interesting about the Putnams that is going to explain their role and what's going on there. And they are some of the main antagonists of this whole situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on episode X67. And I'll tell you, at the end of this episode, what we're going to understand is that the people involved directly in the prosecution of the witches in Salem during the Salem witch trials have an incredible correlation to finding archaeological ruins in the Hotzone, which is quite remarkable. And I think it's going to give us an idea about the battle of the mystery schools that shapes up here and how this is an early chapter in all of that. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. It's great to see so many people out here tonight. I see great familiar faces in the ideas room, and we're going to be looking for those for you. And we'll start taking questions in about 15-20 minutes. Okay. I'm going to go to spectral evidence for a moment here. The official title of in law now from 1982, New Hampshire. Spectral evidence, and this is the case is the state versus Stoughton. Spectral evidence refers to a witness testimony that the accused person is a witness in a dream at the time the accused person's physical at another location. Astral projection. It was accepted in the courts during the Salem witch trials. The evidence was accepted on the basis that the devil and his minions were powerful enough to send their spirits or specters to pure religious people in order to lead them astray. In spectral evidence, the admission of a victim's conjectures is governed only by the limits of their fears and imaginations, whether or not objectively proven facts are forthcoming to justify them. And this is how Stoughton used it. He said, with this preacher that they wanted to get rid of, Burroughs, who was very popular down there, they said, get some witnesses up there. What did you see? And they said, oh, he came to me as a spirit and made me sign the devil's book and all the rest of it. So you can look at this a couple of different ways. Stoughton and his gang there, if they are associated, as I believe they are with these secret societies, could easily have even been causing some of these apparitions by projecting people that they didn't like. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is just that they needed the information so desperately that they had people just make up the stories, which is the most easy and most kind of rote way to explain it. Now, the people who were on the Salem witch trials, one of the things that they did is, in terms of access to good lawyers who understood the difference of evidence, they blocked access, and they had people on the bench there who didn't really understand what he was doing when he introduced spectral evidence. So I think that whole dance gives us an idea that they're trying to inject something here so that they can really close the case. But what they're doing is they're showing a hand that they understand spectral evidence. So Stoughton, by being such a fervent supporter and allowing it when none of the other judges would is maybe showing us two things. One, that he'll do anything to get these witches hanged, yes, but he may also have such a zeal for it that he's dropping the mask and showing he understands all that stuff. That's what I am getting when I'm looking at the spectral evidence aspect. Now let's get into a little bit of what they could be hiding in this relation. So one of the people involved in all of this is would be someone who would become the descendants through would be the Hemingways. Now what's interesting is when you go through and look at the history of the Hemingways here in Massachusetts, they talk a great deal, and it's very, it's kind of fascinating because one of the things that they have during this period from the 1730s to the 1770s that the Hemingways are involved with is something called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is one of those lines that Q and people like that use now, and it's so funny just to look over a little bit of history and see all these different things getting pilfered left and right. You know, it was quite amusing for me. Nothing is terribly original. But here's how the Hemingways show up here. They're talking about the histories, and I have the whole historical charts of these families that I've been studying for a while. Actually, when I did the first Ernest Hemingway episode last year, the fact that they had an alternate spelling, which was Hemingway, which you see around Boston, you know, the streets, Hemingway Street, you see Hemingway Gymnasium just around the corner. There's all this Hemingway, but not with the G. And just, you know, there's no I, no G. So this variation on the name always made me curious. But when you actually get into that family aspect, it's quite fascinating. So,
and you still haven't found out why Hemingway changed it, right?
No, there's not a good solution, except that it appears that there's actually three spellings, which is there's also Hemingway with two N's. But certainly it's Hemingway that the family line comes through, and it's Ralph Hemingway that is the link through all the way. All the relations of this line go back to him, including Ernest Hemingway. And our friend Augustus Hemingway, the richest man in the world, who I'm going to introduce in a moment here and tie this into what's happening. Now, there exists in Framingham today a Hemingway Street, Hemingway School, and a Hemingway Hall on the local state college campus. That's Framingham. What is Framingham, about 30 miles?
It's a little longer, maybe 45.
But it's right outside of Boston, west. The Hemingways are descended from one of the women persecuted during the witch trials. Others descend from the Stone family. These two facts are quite remarkable. And now when we
So she was persecuted but not hanged.
This is the thing.
Okay.
Yes, she wasn't hanged. Now, let's look at Augustus Hemingway. Augustus Hemingway, who became an incredible powerhouse in, you know, with a whole shipping lane career, going to South America and mining and all the rest of it. And he develops what? He develops the largest sugar plantation in Cuba. And remember, so many of the wars that we have with Cuba early on are about sugar. Let's take a quick look at him. First, born in Salem, Massachusetts. Direct Hemingway being right in his descendant line. Ernest Hemingway, the famous writer. He's the son of Dr. Samuel Hemingway. Okay. And what's interesting is his name, when he's born, is Edward Augustus Holyoke Hemingway. And what's going to happen is that Edward and Holyoke are going to go away, which is very interesting. And he's going to just be known as Augustus Hemingway. Yes.
Laura Weekly just pointed out his scarf is an X.
Oh, yeah, right. He does have a kind of a spooky countenance, and his story is a little bit spooky also.
It's sad.
It is, yeah, that he does spend 14 years in a sanitarium. At the age of 13, he started working in Boston as a clerk at Robinson and Parker's dry goods store. He went on to work as a supercargo for Benjamin Bangs, a wealthy ship owner and merchant in Boston. So all these wild things happen. He goes to Chile and all the rest of it. He establishes his own business, and he becomes incredibly wealthy. Now, what's fascinating is he gets so big so fast that, he sucked up into his own mind, and he went into an insane asylum. Now, in 1860, he goes into an insane asylum. Now, he is married to Mary Tileston, who becomes Mary Hemingway. Mary Hemingway is also the daughter of a shipping magnate. And so between them, they become this incredible powerhouse team. Now, as I mentioned, that he actually had this incredible sugar plantation in Cuba, he dies there. That's where he dies. And when we think about Cuba in this period, we're talking now in 1875, 1876 that he dies. And it will be Ernest Hemingway in Cuba now in the 1920s and the 1930s living there. And then by the 1950s, he's full-time. And he's in Bimini and all the rest of it. But this background, the way that they described Hemingway discovering Cuba, and he likes to drink and, flirt with women in Cuba, may very well be true. But his family, aspects of his family, which were the richest people in the world at the time, owned sugar plantations there. That's a much better reason to go and explore your family history. That gets us closer. This is where we start to dig through the kind of facade of these stories and get to what these people were actually doing in the hot zone. Now, Mary Hemingway was the daughter of Thomas Tileston, one of the wealthiest merchant mariners of New York City. Their daughter, their daughter-in-law from their son founds the Audubon Society. So, and is an incredible environmentalist. And these people are so well known for their philanthropy if you go through their history. That's all they're doing with their money is giving it away, which is quite remarkable. Now, let's get into how this correlates with the Hemingways and the hot zone and the ruins and the archaeology that takes place. Now, we know that he's directly descendant from one of the people accused in the Salem witch trials. 1. 2, he's from Salem. 3, she creates a museum in Salem. Now, she did something else very interesting, which is after he's dead, she figures out, how am I going to spend all this money?
It's a nice problem to have.
Problem solver. And what she actually does is she sponsors something, which is called the Hemingway Southwestern Archaeological Expedition for 10 years, over $100,000, which translates back then into millions of dollars now. So archaeology is what she channels the money into. Her son was also named Augustus Hemingway. He, like I said, his wife becomes the leader of the Audubon Society. He does a 10-year spree of archaeology in Arizona, even though he's a congressman. So the Hemingway family now has a huge background in archaeology. As a matter of fact, this Southwestern Archaeological Expedition is the most cutting-edge archaeology that has ever been done in that period. So we're looking at a group here which knows a great deal about archaeology and how to find lost cultures, and they make it the Zuni in that case. And the Zunis, the ones that are left, come up here, and some of the first Zuni visits to Boston are to Mary Hemingway. So the Southwestern Archaeological Expedition to the American Southwest is a groundbreaker in terms of American archaeology. The Hemingways had the money, they had the backing, they had the know-how, and apparently, because of this unusual connection to Salem, etc., they had the lineage for it. And I'm going to explain that in a minute too. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. Here we are in X episode 67. And we're going deep, and we're learning that the Salem witch trials actually have a direct connection and correlation to individuals in the hot zone. In the previous couple of episodes, we've looked at Howard Hughes and his association with Ernest Hemingway, calling himself Tom Garden. and how that all plays out. This episode now is bringing those threads even tighter together. We're starting to understand that there's a code in relation to being in the hot zone and what they're doing there. And all these figures being in the hot zone, waiting for these ruins, trying to find these ruins, and observing the geopolitical dance that's taking place. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, and make sure that you're on, because, the truth is I appreciate the whole social media aspects that we do, but I do feel like it's so easy for them just to pull the plug. So the only way to make sure is to make sure you're on that mailing list. And it's a free newsletter. You will get it once a week, and it's going to give you the real kind of updated knowledge about the show that you're going to need for anything that's coming up, including some very, very special guests and events that you're not going to want to miss. Now, also subscribe to the show when you get there. Make sure that you are a member and get behind the work that we're doing here. When you think about it, there's a lot of information flowing around out there, but this is a good period to get behind the kind of work that we're doing that I think is really opening doors. And to support that work, the best thing to do, you can contribute, you can subscribe. We've made the subscription so inexpensive. And, because we want everybody to be able to just get on board with it. But it's great when you guys get behind the work that we're doing here. It makes it a whole lot easier. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Do you want a question?
Sure.
Well, actually, I wanted to mention this. Starlight said the book Yuri by Dr. Andrea Puharich made contact with an ET source in the Near East with Uri Geller, and that contact called itself Spectra.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I found this whole thing about Spectre in a patent, and we remember that HARP, which is the weather modification work program that Nick Bagage did so much good work on, and so did Ilana Freeland. We talked about this recently. A major part of that was built with Tesla technology, but what she told me about it was that there's an aspect to it that's based on influencing people's moods on the ground. And it's funny because a lot of the mystery school activities, on the left-hand sides, those more black arts stuff, is they're able to send what they would call these specters over groups to make them act in certain ways. And splitting up those perceptions is the body of work of the other groups inside the mystery schools. So the specter thing and the spectral evidence, as we see it there, is basically like saying, when you get into the information about the astral plane, and when you're dealing with that, you're dealing with a whole different level and a whole different dimension of understanding. When we look at projects like CERN, and we look at the things that they're doing, saying, hey, we're opening up other dimensions and it's fun, we can see that something else is happening there. When we were going through some of the movies earlier, and some of the kind of iconic pieces from things like Alice in Wonderland and things of this nature, we're starting to see they are dealing with dimensional realities in all of those. As a matter of fact, I remember reading a really studied analysis of Alice in Wonderland that showed it was basically a shamanistic initiation, which is something I think that we proved very well the last time. But I always find it interesting for people who are familiar with certain techniques of initiation to look at something like that. But I think that we see it too in some of the movies that are pushed and some of the things that we see. We're getting into that area of what Rudolf Steiner calls the eighth sphere, where is the information there to entertain you, or is it there to kind of trap your consciousness? And so we have to be aware of that when we're in such a heavily entertainment-driven society like the one that we're in now. So it gives us that kind of way to look at it. Yes?
A cult fan wanted to know about drawing down the moon in witchcraft and the left-hand path Black Lodge in the occult.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of techniques that when you are someone who's not familiar with the higher levels of the mystery schools, there are a lot of techniques that get used, just like you hear about like animal rituals and things like that. They're used, but on the astral plane, when they're seen from the vantage point of the mystery schools, they're looked upon as kind of dead weight. And so they almost arrive at sort of parlor tricks and things like that. The real moon magic aspect, I think that the older cultures really understood how to harness it, because the moon having such control over the tides and the tides in our own bodies, etc. Obviously, we lost somewhere along the line a better understanding of how to use it. But if you look into things like Steiner and what he was doing with biodynamic farming, the moon is always front and center. So the nature-religion aspect, I think, is very powerful. In terms of the Black Lodges, they are, they stand there with the kind of same information as the mystery schools. And their motivations are, there are degrees, but when you say black, you're really going into the left-hand side, because there are, they literally have a definition of gray schools, which is schools that do things for their own knowledge, and they don't work for the higher good. They're not trying to move society. So that's one category. But the black ones, I think we see very active in society, and it seems like they're always behind corruption. They're always behind drugs and addiction and things of this nature on the surface. Underneath, their goal is highly harmonic. So what they largely want to do is control humanity's consciousness, because, of course, it's humanity's consciousness that dreams the world. So, but a great question, and I have to say that a cult fan, what we know, thank God Olivia tipped us off, because I know it's your birthday, and
on Hobbit Day, the 22nd.
On Hobbit Day, on the 22nd. So this is for you, and it is, Olivia cooked that one up, but it's quite remarkable. So make sure it's a happy birthday.
You will definitely have a happy birthday.
Fantastic. And I'm guessing then the 22nd makes him you are a Libra.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. A lot of Libras. A lot of Libras there. So happy birthday. Everyone, it's great to have you here for this episode, X Series episode 67. Now we're going to take a look at what might be going on that they might want to have been kind of covering up in relation to the hot zone. Let's get into that aspect. Okay, a lot of us know a great deal about archaeology that's been done. We've shown like the underwater ruins in Cuba, etc. How would you like to see a group of Atlanteans and how their information was found in Florida? This gets really quite remarkable, and I think that there's going to be so much more to this story in relation to the hot zone and archaeology. But let's look at a very interesting expedition that took place in a very interesting place called Putnam County in Florida. And remember that name Putnam, because I'm going to draw it right back to the Salem witch trials again.
This is where it gets crazy.
And creepy.
Mm.
Now, one of the things, I'm also going to introduce the key Marco stuff, but first let's take a look at this mask, which was found among these very unusual mound ruins in Putnam County. During an expedition in the 1950s. Let's take a look at some of these other figures. Now, side by side with some of these were some very, and I mean very advanced ruins indeed. One of them, as I studied 3 or 4 different aspects of this and started to put pieces together, I'm actually convinced that in this Putnam County excavation of these mounds, they have found the first visible evidence of the two-way stone. Now, the two-way stone is something that's identified in the Cayce readings as what powered Atlantis, and I'm going to read shortly exactly how it did that. But I want you to take a look first at what they found. This is from the Moore, Florida sand mounds. That is a power station depiction. And I believe now the first one on record of the Two Eyes Stone. Now, found with it were unusual copper plates, which we're going to look at them oxidized and black and white. This is what they looked like. And this, again, in the Putnam County mounds, which are dated about somewhere between 3000 and 2000 BC, but they didn't do the carbon dating. My guess is they go a lot further back. Take a good look at that. Let's look at these very, very unusual symbols of eyes, and again, this spiral. We have here some of the earliest Atlantean ruins coming to light in Florida in the middle of all this.
Do we have any idea how old that is?
Well, I did read the age just now, which
okay,
was they say it's between 3 and 2000 BC, but they haven't done proper carbon testing on this because it's not really explained why, but when you look at the original expedition, they haven't. Another view of this, just a little black and white. When you think of the Two Eyes Stone set up as power stations, and you see the almost 3D nature of this, and you think, yeah, primitive Indians during this period. It's not very likely. But a spin-off from a very advanced culture that had to adapt itself to very primitive circumstances, absolutely. And again, the look of these power stations in Putnam County. Now, when we look at the archaeology that's been done in the Florida mounds, it gets very interesting because as I brought in Hemingway's extensive archaeology, the Hemingways doing this southwestern archaeology that really kind of broke the bank and broke the mold for how to do archaeology, then we start to look at Ernest Hemingway and all of his trips into Bimini, and then we start to see his mother and the readings with Edgar Cayce, and we start to see Cayce talking about Bimini and Hemingway going there, and Cayce talking about the ruins that are off of Bimini. Now, let's take a quick look at something quite remarkable that came out. First of all, these are the this is the actual Bimini Road, and that is those enormous stones that were predicted by Cayce to rise in 68 or 69. It turned out it was 68. Now, we talk a great deal about the Bimini Wall and how it's some of the earliest, it's the first rising of the Poseidon Temple, according to Cayce, but it is also some of the earliest remnants of Atlantis that we have. So it's some of the best evidence at this point. Now, let's tie that into this very unusual story, which is in an elder, a section for senior citizens in a Miami newspaper called Miami New Times. Here's a headline for you. 2 long-lost maps spark a quest to find forgotten pyramids in the Florida swamps. And inside this article, by the way, just as a related, but not from this article, is you might have seen these, there's these geo-coordinates going around where people think that they found these pyramids off the coast of Florida. And I have to say that in looking at these, I do think they're quite remarkable. I'm going to do a little more information before I say for sure and try to get something on that. But I think that this is more evidence like the Bimini Wall that we're going to be seeing, especially so many people on Google Earth. Of course, they do, as we know, cloud a lot of things on Google Earth, but I think it's getting harder and harder to hide that kind of evidence. Don't you think so?
I do.
I had a lot of fun with Google Earth, but I'll tell you, it's very time consuming. Okay, so we're going to crisscross something about the people involved in this discovery. Remember, this is kind of a buried article in some senior citizen Miami magazine. This person is named J. Manson Valentine. He found the Bimini Wall, And he was known as a very famous Yale zoologist, actually, and he got a lot of trouble from his colleagues for finding the Bimini Wall and saying it was related to Atlantis. In the article, we've got someone who is digging through some old files as a writer and researcher for the museum. And the article is by Nathaniel Sandler. And I have had a conversation with someone at the museum. It's quite interesting. I'll get into that. What we hear is that there's a phrase in these documents that's pyramids in the Everglades. And then this guy looks at the map, and he's kind of going through how he did this with his friend. The first map was printed on a large piece of paper, almost a handbill, with circles depicting what appeared to be settlements. A second normal-sized sheet was covered with markings pointing toward another obscure site near the glades. Attached was a hand-drawn note card depicting some kind of ancient dagger. The attached letters only added to the intrigue in straightforward prose. They describe the remnants of a lost civilization in the Florida swamps. Now, including a pyramid guarded by an underground room full of snakes. That's a tough one.
Very Indiana Jones.
True. The writer had seen the ruins with his own eyes. Now watch how this gets very deep very fast. So this guy goes on and on about these letters. So I'm going to move along here. But in the letters is J. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Road. The letters are from 1970 and 1971. The person in the letters, J. Manson Valentine, is perhaps Miami's foremost gentleman explorer, scientist, historian, and world traveler, whose lifelong curiosity led him to some strange places, including becoming a world expert on the lost city of Atlantis, which is quite true. An enigmatic former honorary curator of the Miami Science Museum, he's responsible for filling many of the shelves of oddities inside the curious vault. The second key character is far more shadowy, L. Frank Hudson. It's definitely a pseudonym. The author of the letters, who claimed to have made the discovery of a lifetime. Their tales are in 2 untold chapters of Florida's rich history. And then there's a whole thing in there about treasure hunting, etc., which I'll spare you the details. Now, during a research trip to the Bahamas in 1969, Valentine noted a strange geological formation just off the island of Bimini. 300 feet long, the site included curving megalithic submerged rocks. By all appearances, were man-made. Now, I mean, I know everyone's aware of this, but the Bimini Wall basically sets traditional history on its head, because there's nothing in archaeology that accounts for a culture that sank that was advanced. They just don't have it in that area in particular, and they just don't want to hear about it either. So he goes on here, and he's talking a little bit about the reaction that was going on for the Bimini Road. But remember again, when we're talking about Hemingway and Cayce and the Bimini Road, that it's Cayce who predicts that they're going to find this in 68 or 69, and then he adds, not so far away, because he gave the reading in 1943. And then we think about Hemingway being in touch, his family being close with the Cayces, and Hugh Lynn Cayce going to spend a month with the Hemingways in Chicago. Okay, so these things start to chime. Okay, the letters are typed on aged paper. Remember, these are letters tucked away in this very strange Florida State Museum. April 70 is the first letter. The second letter is June 1971. Both make an outrageous claim in starkly calm language, namely that there are undiscovered pyramids throughout the Everglades and other parts of Florida from an unknown civilization. I recently talked, quote, this is in the letters, I recently talked with a man who lives on a ranch near Immokalee, who claims to have seen in the Big Pyramid in the Big Cypress Swamp, L. Frank Hudson writes in the first letter. He says that there are stairs leading down to a room into an underground passage. And then the next letter is from 1971. It says, we visited a small stone pyramid made of smooth, faced stones. It reaches down to the ground as far as the probing rod will go, which makes me think it's going down to bedrock about 65 feet deep, nearly a mile-long wall. Hudson, in other words, had seen these pyramids with his own eyes, and there are more. He wrote, "The same man told me of visiting, or rather seeing, a similar stone pyramid in the middle of a mangrove swamp just off of Lossman's River. I've also been told of a stone pyramid with a room inside sitting in the middle of a cow pasture just off Peace River on a Florida ranch. I'm beginning to think that the lost civilization here in Florida may have been far more extensive than I imagined." These are the letters between J. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Road, and this very unusual, shadowy figure named Hudson, who's total pseudonym, and who gets very hard to figure out who he is exactly. But one of the things that I came up with when I was going through this is that there's a group out there called the Deering family, who were behind a company called International Harvester, and they had placed a great deal of unusual, very early weather detection items there. And they were working on this technology, and what happened is somewhere along the line, they ran across this. And I think this is how it was hushed up. But in any case, he goes on and on. And so what we have is these very strange pyramids that were seen by J. Manson Valentine and this person Hudson. Later in the article, Hudson also talks about being hiding things off the coast of Cuba, and he's paying as payment for Castro's assassination. I mean, he really goes into some weird territory, suggesting that the CIA are involved in all that. But here's what's interesting for me. As you go further and further into these letters, the author of the article looks up the person who was working at the museum at the time. And he says, "Do you remember these weird letters between Manson Valentine and this other strange guy?" And he says, "Oh, yeah." And he's like, "Oh, well, they were about a pyramid. What did you think of all that?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I saw it." And so the guy who worked at the museum, had gone along with Valentine and this weird guy Hudson, and he'd gone and seen these pyramids in these swamps of Florida. So we have something very unusual there, which is a huge discovery in Putnam County in Florida of pyramids. I mean, this is remarkable in the sense of who is discovering it and how it was covered up. I think when I look at it, I believe, looking at J. Manson Valentine and the trouble he got into over the Bimini Wall, that he played it down and didn't bring out the pyramids that they found there in Florida. And as a matter of fact, I think when we look at it, what we're looking at is Valentine using his Yale connections, and Yale somehow getting involved in this. Yale is very known, along with the Smithsonian, for covering things up, and that's why I think this hangs in the balance. Except unusually, strangely enough, there's this lonely author writing for a seniors magazine who happened to work in that museum and found these very, very unusual letters. So I'm going to round all that out with this. Two of Hudson's letters and a series of maps lay forgotten in J. Manson Valentine's archives in this museum. So he got his hands on the maps, and they were trying to retrace the steps, but they had a hard time figuring it out. It had directions in it, like on the edge of the glades to the east of the Big Cypress and things like that. So it doesn't look to me like he got very far with it. This article was written in 2014. However, I do believe Manson Valentine was not the kind of guy to make up stories. He had an incredibly distinguished career. Now, I want to introduce something here about Manson Valentine and someone else, which is there's a person who's famous to ufologists, who is Morris Jessup, who was someone involved with the Philadelphia experiment. Well, long story short, Morris Jessup was basically working on the Philadelphia experiment, and he had been putting out this book on UFOs, which had all this incredible information, and he was really kind of a elder statesman for the UFO thing instead of going into, kind of discredited land. But this is the late 50s, and he's coming out as an astronomer with all this information. And then he shows up dead, quite unusually. And the story on him was that, he was suicidal, he was getting, depressed about his work, but no one seemed to think that that was true. And he was found unusually on a highway with his car running and the, basically the carbon monoxide filling up the car. Now, Morris Jessup is always somebody that I identified as being wiped out by X-Protect. But it was always said that in his book, The Case for the UFO, somebody had made all of these unusual annotations. And these unusual annotations referred to the Philadelphia experiment. It's how we found out about it, which is basically Project Invisibility. Now, what happened is that book inside the Navy became Xeroxed, and all of the annotations became something that all of these top naval officers exchanged with each other, and they were like, how did this guy get access to all of this high-level invisibility stuff that we're working with? And so Jessup learned about this, and it said, well, he called a good friend and said, I'm heading over to your place, I need to talk to you about this. And that's how he died. So for the first time in all of this, I've never heard this anywhere, and I believe this is quite explosive. The person he was heading over to see was J. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Road. And Manson Valentine, this is 1958, when Jessup dies. Manson Valentine becomes the person who discovers the Bimini Road, and then later, these weird Florida pyramids. Well, let's see what that information was. Inside the book, Philadelphia Experiment, quote, by Charles Berlitz, it says, the experiment, Jessup told Dr. J. Manson Valentine, had been accomplished using naval-type magnetic generators known as degaussers, which were pulsed at resonant frequencies so as to create a tremendous magnetic field on and around a docked vessel. This is how they achieved invisibility, working with Einstein. Quote, Jessup talking to Valentine now, Morris Jessup, who got bumped off shortly afterwards. The experiment is very interesting but awfully dangerous. It is too hard on the people involved. This use of magnetic resonance is tantamount to temporary obliteration in our dimension, but it tends to get out of control. Actually, it is equivalent to transference of matter into another level or dimension, and could represent a dimensional breakthrough if it were possible to control it. We get an idea of why he got bumped off, 1. 2, we get an idea of what Valentine knows, J. Manson Valentine, and how he was able to find the Bimini Road as a much deeper level of understanding of these things. When you put these factors together about what was happening there, the cherry on top is that Putnam County, where they found it, is named for Israel Putnam, who is from Salem. So we have these Hemingways in Salem, we have Israel Putnam in Salem, and we have this clash of Andros, who they named Andros Island off of Bimini after, and his setting up of Stoughton, who performed the Salem witch trials. It gives us a whole understanding of the crisscross of the powers that are organized around the ruins that are in the hot zone. And even going down to the Philadelphia experiment, which is about Project Invisibility, we see that Manson Valentine, before finding the Bimini Road, was deeply involved with that project. So over the centuries, the group X-Share, trying to move this information out to the public through the mystery schools, and X-Protect, bumping off people like Morris Jessup and committing the Salem witch trials. Those forces battling it out over time. And here we are in the middle of it all. And with that, Miss Olivia?
I don't think you got around to those other members of the Hemingway clan, did you?
Oh, well, there are more. I'll get to them while we're doing the questions.
Do it right now. Do it for me.
No, I have to literally do it. So
okay,
let's start with questions and we'll go into it.
All right, they're great. Okay, so Kontiki Man wanted to know, how does DJ estimate the chances of the Navy group being behind soft disclosure, having links to Autech and or the Kennedy-Hemingway legacy?
No question. Well, look, Autech is on Andros Island. I mean, they also have branches off the coast of Florida. But I do feel that when you're looking at X-Protect, that there's no question that Autech is a big piece of that. Now, you can say there were people who go in and that who just literally do their job and whatever. They don't have any idea, and they're compartmentalized. They don't have any idea of what we're talking about, the deeper significance of it. They're just showing up for a job, so they're not sinister. I'm not saying anything like that. Just like people in the Navy aren't sinister. Most of them are terrific patriots. The point is the organizations and how they're used. So a lot of the UAP, UFO thing that's been going on through the Navy, and they're trying to say, well, it's this big breakthrough that the Navy said that, these were unidentified flying objects. If you go to 1950 and have Harry Truman talking on camera to reporters, they ask him about UFOs. And he says, yeah, we know they're out there, but we don't think they pose a national security threat, but we'll keep an eye on it. So he said the same thing that they just said. But because it's part of this weird CIA push to commandeer UFO disclosure using Tom DeLonge, which is something they call a dangle or a bobo in intelligence terms. And the bobo is to set out there to take the temperature of the pulse of the public. And DeLonge being a singer and all this kind of stuff, it's kind of like, they need a story, these guys. And so they set him up with CIA agent Elizondo, and they come out and they say, oh, we're breaking through, we're doing all this stuff. But they're working with John Podesta and Hillary Clinton and all that. So, that kind of CIA disclosure is, it's exactly the thing that you don't want, And I think that what might be happening is the true UFO research might be splintering into two groups, which is this weird showbiz thing that's taken over ufology, and it's got the CIA money pouring into it. And the CIA control of the media. That is really a disgusting thing. The other thing, which I think is just the UFO file study, that's where there's plenty of information there, and it is not tainted by the CIA trying to turn it into a weird threat to work through Congress for money and use the media to create von Braun's alien threat scenario. For me, people who I used to respect, like Knapp and others who are working with TTSA, I mean, what can you do? All I can do is say that I'm never going to work with the CIA on the UFO file. You couldn't pay me enough money to do it. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Najat Madri. Does St. Andrew's Cross connect with St. Andrew's Island?
Hey, that is a fascinating. I like where you're going with that. You said that, and then there's someone from You Are Free TV. She does a great job, and she mentioned something about an island near Bimini where the Chinese, which was particularly hit hard in the Bahamas, where the Chinese had a lot of equipment, and I thought that was very interesting that she came up with that. So great work from You Are Free TV covering that. And in terms of your question, I do believe that in terms of St. Andrew's Cross, I don't know if that's that's why they named St. Andrews, but someone out there can actually get into who named St. Andrews and why. That's a great idea. Great question.
Okay, Najat again. I don't know a lot about the Salem witch trials. How did Tituba end up in Salem?
Well, it's interesting. This is what used to happen, which is there are these landowners, and then they would take, when they came over from England, they would take the people that they had with them. So if she was obviously from Barbados, but had gone to the UK, and then they had taken her over. So there were, those types of indentured servants throughout the colonies in that period. But what I find very interesting when we look at a figure like Tituba is that on the low end of the totem pole, working as a servant around the Salem witch trials, is Tituba from Barbados. On the high level of setting up the operation of the Salem witch trials is Andros, who ruled in Barbados. So, there we have that Caribbean tie-in to all this, and somehow it's relating to this island culture. And so on either side of the fence, these people are associated with. When we mentioned Henry Morgan, he was associated with all that. So I think that we're getting the sense that the hot zone has been influential for a very long time.
Mod Wiz wanted to add that another tie he sees with the St. Andrew's Cross is the blue and white motif.
Oh, that's really
one.
excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good to see you out there, Mod Wiz. Yeah, absolutely. I also feel that, it's interesting when you look at St. Andrew's Cross, it is the way, just as later they introduced the Chiro and really, bringing that out, which is the X in combination with something else. So I'm going to combine the X with the cross, or I'm going to combine the X with a particular teaching. It keeps it, it perpetuates it, so when something new comes in, it integrates it. Yes.
I know this is off topic, but discussing this.
Absolutely.
Kelvin Tahuti wanted to know, was the UFO disclosure with Tom DeLonge a failure? Are they trying to relaunch the media campaign with yesterday's news story with the military saying the release of UFO images was a big mistake / boo-boo?
Yeah, well, it was John Greenwald from the Black Vault who talked to the Navy and got them to say anything. What they said was that Elizondo had ran out the back door with those terrible videos, which are some of the worst videos of UFOs I've ever seen in my life. And there was, there are people who are visual experts who showed how the lens itself could have made a lot of what we see there in terms of one of those videos at least. And those videos have been around a long time. Here's what's funny about all this. Those videos came out in 2007 on YouTube. Okay? That's how exclusive the TTSA is. That stuff came out 12 years ago on YouTube. Anybody who's looked into it knows that. So I guess it ain't so exclusive, huh? TTSA, all of their board members, Lockheed Martin or CIA, the amount of years of experience of CIA personnel is over 100 years. So you have one guy who has 30 years experience, you have another doctor who's 25 years experience. Their main people are all Central Intelligence Agency people. People who follow to the Stars Academy, do you know what the Central Intelligence Agency is? Do you really want to give them the UFO file? Do you want to take their word for it when their profession is to lie? So the Central Intelligence Agency is a completely extra-constitutional agency. It's not even envisioned in the Constitution, and Harry Truman, who created it, he said he regretted it after the Kennedy assassination, and he said, basically reform it or get rid of it. Well, that's what Kennedy was trying to do. And we see that they have, this incredible overarching influence on all of these different coups and things through the years. They just don't represent the best interests of America at all. And to inject them into the UFO story and to say, hey, the CIA are heroes fighting aliens, give us lots of money, it's the worst. It's the worst possible. I literally think that ufology, that version of ufology, and it will take some good people with it, is a total junk CIA version. And that the UFO file studies might have to be taken in a different direction by people who actually care about the subject. And we know that the UFO file is right in the heart of the X technology. And that could be maybe a whole new direction for looking at that. But I'll tell you this, working with the Central Intelligence Agency on the UFO file, this very same people in the UFO field who used to warn about that, like Knapp, like Dolan, they know better. They know it very well. So my feeling is, what are you going to say? It's like working with the mafia. You probably get a better shake from the mafia, actually. So no, I don't expect any truth out of the CIA, and I do feel that the TTSA was losing momentum, and I actually think that there are a lot of moves behind the scenes to promote them again. Remember, that's a political operation that came out of Hillary Clinton's campaign, and it was DeLong, Podesta, Clinton, and some of those people, and they thought Clinton was going to get in. When she didn't get in, then it got haywire, and they had to release this kind of half-worked-out version of it. And when you think about that, you know, Trump has the Space Force. That's his way of getting his hands back on the UFO file from these private corporations that are in aerospace that hold it. And then on the other side, you have this Clinton, Podesta, Tom DeLonge, Luis Elizondo, CIA rigmarole. And remember, the CIA tried to throw the president out of office as well. So, you know, I mean, they just want to control these things. So now the UFO people who have written these books for years about how the CIA and the government have been blocking UFO disclosure or going arm in arm with them, with TTSA, it's ridiculous. So either you have integrity on the subject or you don't. If you don't, get out. You know, get out of the business, do something else. Go to Wall Street. There's lots of places for your lack of ethics right there.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like they're really, I mean, they've got a second season.
They do. They have a second season of Unidentified. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the Bobo thing. I mean, the CIA has a lot of influence. A lot. And especially in entertainment. And that didn't surprise me at all. Except that the show is so terrible.
Yeah.
You know, and... You know, it repeats things that are patently false, saying that UFOs cause these fires. When you can look up, anyone can look up the story where in that the last show that they did, they said that the UFO came out of nowhere and caused all these fires. And then if you look in any Italian newspaper website, you can go back and see that there's an arsonist who set those fires. Those guys just want to lie to have a threat narrative. And notice they mention threat over and over again. Because threat equals money in their mind, and fear equals power. So this is what you get when you deal with the CIA. They rolled in the CIA with TTSA 2017. It's pretty recent. Before that, they worked behind the scenes. With TTSA, they're out front. Elizondo's a former intelligence agent. You know, their main guys are all CIA. It's on the record. That's not me saying, hey, I think they're CIA. They're all CIA on the record. So... if you want CIA disclosure, you don't know a whole heck of a lot about their history. That's the way it goes. So, yeah, it is. But I'll tell you, when it comes to the TTSA, they've been exposed, you know, by people like Greenwald. And the fact that the CIA manipulates them on the board, you know, they even did a conference recently where it was only like a third of the people that were expected to show up actually did. I don't think they have a lot of grassroots support. What they have is financial and intelligence and media support. And
if you got that, you don't need the little peons.
Right, exactly. Okay, keep rolling.
Okay.
TTSA. You can tell there's a TTSA episode coming up.
Kontiki Man again. A little off topic. Has DJ contemplated looking into the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's research on ancient DNA?
I like that a lot. I do feel that there's a lot of things with Hughes that I think need to be followed up with generally, but I would say the answer is yes.
Yeah, he is. There's a lot of rabbit holes associated with him.
Yeah, great one. Great question.
Chris Beatty, did the Hemingways have any relationship with William Randolph Hearst, who helped start the Spanish-American War? Did Hearst want the U.S. to have possession and influence over Cuba?
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because now I'm going to segue into some of those very interesting connections with the Hemingways. And you're going to find that the Hemingways are related directly to two presidents, which I found very interesting. One of them is Richard Nixon. And I mean directly related. And then another one that shows up in there is William Howard Taft, who took over after Teddy Roosevelt and was really the Wall Street minion of all time. But that family line is quite remarkable. One other thing I wanted to mention before I go into that, I wanted to show this thing about San Marco Island, which is in the hot zone, or Key Marco, excuse me. Here it is. Take a look at the red dot. Here it is. Bingo. So, in looking at that, it's right off the coast of Florida. And this, again, in terms of Florida ruins, this is what they found there. Now, here's where Olivia's Egyptian knowledge is going to come in handy. Olivia, what does that look like to you?
Well, it's clearly different, but it reminded me immediately of Bast.
Yes, yes.
The cat goddess.
Excellent point. I think that this is kind of remarkable, and you're not going to get a primitive culture that can create something like this, which actually shows a very human pose.
Yeah, cats don't sit like that.
Right, that's an excellent point. But in terms of that background with Hemingway, look, here's what we have on Hemingway's background, which I think is remarkable. One, that his ancestors go back to the Salem witch trials. Two, that Augustus Hemingway, before they changed it to Hemingway, was the richest man in the world along with Rockefeller in the mid-19th century. We don't get to hear a lot about him. As a matter of fact, there's an article I was reading in Salem where his wife started the Peabody Salem Museum, and they said, it's really weird that people in Salem don't know much about Mary Hemingway. Yeah, it is. So we have that in their background, and we have them with this extensive archaeological background. And I think that that's very key. But when we get into Nixon and the Millhouse section, crisscrossing directly with the Hemingways, I feel very strongly that when you see Ernest Hemingway in Bimini, and you see who's spending all this time in Bimini in the late 60s, Richard Nixon. I mean, it's quite remarkable when you track it that way. The Hemingways have always held these secrets through time. They're definitely one of those families. So when we see people like Marielle and her older sister now kind of making their way, you're just happy that they got through all that. And Marielle made a movie called Running from Crazy, which was about a lot of those dynamics. And remember, her father, Jack, was a CIA agent who, his own, for Ernest, he was afraid that his own son was going to track him for the CIA. So he was cautious when he dealt with them. So it's quite remarkable, I think, when you look at the impact of what he did in the hot zone. And then, of course, you have JFK working with Mary Hemingway, his widow, to get his vault out of Cuba and risking a national security incident to do it. And now all those records, as far as we know, all of them are held at the JFK Library. I mean, these are connections which really you won't find anywhere but in the exsteganography research that we're doing here. And all I'm saying with that is, these are the thing. I mean, this is how we get a real picture going, and that's how a lot of the exsteganography works. Yes.
Jake Dragonfruit and Humming Dragonfly both wanted to know if you found any
Wait, Dragonfruit and Dragonfly?
Yes.
Whoa.
If you found any relationship between the Salem witch trials and the Celtic Druid mythology, or
yes. Mm-hmm. Well, we know that a lot of the Celtic and Druid practices were persecuted, very much like the Salem witches. So there's definitely a correlation there. I feel that it seems to me that the Druids knew how to hide what they were doing at a certain point. They realized the incredible persecution from the church was coming for them. I also feel like when we look at people like Egerton Sykes talking about traditions, like the Tuatha De Danann and groups like that we've done programs on, there's a great overlap from Atlantis, from this destroyed culture, that's still alive in those Irish traditions. So yeah, absolutely, it is quite fascinating. I mentioned this picture here. That is JFK with Mary Hemingway, and they have a big conference, and then he talks to his CIA director, and he works out this kind of national security details about a national security incident to happen at Hemingway's Finca Vigia, his big place there in Cuba. And if you go through any historian, no one knows what that national security incident is, which is fascinating because, what were they planning to do there? What was the importance of this vault? It does eventually get taken over to America in a shrimp boat, smuggled by intelligence people. So that's straight from Kennedy and his own people doing that. It's quite unusual.
And gummy bears says, I never put this together. Marielle named her daughter Langley.
Oh, did she really?
I guess so.
Oh, that's great. Well, what's interesting and kind of spooky is that Marielle was born on November 22nd.
Oh.
But it's 1961.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
It's just, numbers, right? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's X episode 67, and we're going...
67!
It's amazing. It's great to have everyone here. It's a fantastic crowd tonight. We've gone deep into the Salem witch trials and its connection to the hot zone. Going to reveal a little bit more before we're done here, but we're taking your questions now. We'll take them all in caps. Remember to go to the Dark Journalist website and sign up for our newsletter. That's how we stay in touch. They literally, I know that they've been knocking a lot of people, basically saying that they're not getting their requests, they're not figuring out that the show's coming up, and that it turns out that YouTube's just not telling people the way that they used to. So hopefully that's not a sign of things to come, and they won't throw us off social media. But I will say this, in case there is that kind of censorship, the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is to make sure you're on the mailing list. So go to Dark Journalist and do that. That's a free newsletter, and we'll just keep you up to date on all the incredible things that we have coming up. While you're there, subscribe to the show, get behind the work that we're doing here, because there's going to be some very explosive things coming up for you. Okay, and Miss Olivia will take the last round of questions here.
Okay, I did want to ask these. So Jeremy Dark Eagle says, is voodoo considered a mystery school? Herzenstern responded, voodoo is mystical warfare.
That's no question. Well, you have bastardized versions of these things. It could have come from a very high art at one point. You might have healed people that way, and it got reversed. These
are shamanic traditions from Africa.
Yes.
And they met up with Christian practices, and it's just a blend.
I think when you say blend, I think of Creole and how it's
Absolutely.
A combination of French and all these different languages.
Well, I went to a Santeria ritual with a priest quite a few years ago, and yes, there was a chicken sacrifice, and when in Rome, you go with it. And but what was so interesting is on his altar, he had so many pictures and effigies of different saints from all different traditions. It was such a blending of, there was the Virgin Mary, and there were, people I didn't recognize of all different races, and it was all blended in there. It was fascinating.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I think that that's true. But you're good like that too, which is you show up as kind of an intrepid journalist in these little different places too, because you did that with Dom and Her. You went to that.
Again, because my mother was an atheist and I was raised without any kind of belief system, I have had to go on a journey to find my own way. So I have gone out of my way to find my path.
See, now I know why you sacrificed that blue chicken. Now it makes sense. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Okay, the last round of questions. I see great people out there tonight, and it's great to have everyone here. Right now, I would say we've got about 7 minutes left, so go for it.
To be honest, I don't have a lot of questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I did want to ask you one thing.
Yes.
Did you come across a character named Cyrus Teed? Teed? Okay, because if not, we're going to have to follow up on this.
Oh, good. You know what?
Okay.
Whoever it is who put that in there, send me any information that you have on that, and I will go ahead and look it up. info@darkjournalist.com is the best way to reach us for that. Or if you have any kind of tips or information, info@darkjournalist is definitely the best way to go. But yeah, we'll look them up. We we make it our life's work to actually find this kind of information, so please do. I wanted to mention this. Didn't get a chance to show so many things tonight, but this I will show you. The company that I was talking about, International Harvester, It's the Deering family. They were operating in Florida where those ruins were. And we're going to get into this family and what they were doing down there with this, what they said was weather measuring equipment, which I don't buy that for a moment. But they started as McCormick Harvesting Machine, and I found their earliest kind of logo there online. They were out of Chicago, and they became International Harvester, which was known for coming in and bullying the farmers and saying, hey, either take our equipment and go into this credit debt hole, or we're going to rough you up and burn your farm or whatever. Very interesting history on these guys. So, and again, the fact that they're operating in the zone where the Florida pyramids are, I found quite unique. Okay, Miss Olivia.
A cult fan wanted to know, I wonder if there's some coded green language that women were sacrificed in a place that anagrams to males, which is what somebody had pointed out earlier, that Salem is an anagram for males.
That's very interesting. I just like thinking about that. My feeling is that generally, part of the problem and part of the thing I think that the mystery schools helped remedy by putting Blavatsky out there as their spokesperson in 1875 instead of a man was, this was the problem. It was this suppression of female intuition. You know, a lot of the things that Steiner talks about is that when you look at it etherically from the perspective of anthroposophy, that men are closer down with the physical reality of the earth, whereas women are, you know, in terms of that, on the etheric level, they're a little bit above, which we've noticed, and so they have a more natural connection to that spiritual side. So no question that it's certainly that kind of female mysticism was largely suppressed, and they were afraid of it also in the sense that it could dethrone them. So suppression was the way to go, which we've seen that operative in many of these stories. Yeah.
Esoteric 369 Wall wants to know, any hidden pyramids in Salem, possibly?
Isn't that interesting? It's always very magical to go there, and there's just something in the air about it. I always feel a lot of almost like spirits in the air there. But, you know, there is a place called America's Stonehenge, which isn't far from Salem, but it's over the border into New Hampshire. They used to call it Mystery Hill. And that's a very, very unusual place. I don't think that it's ever been well explained, and it's not like a Phoenician fort or whatever they tried to say it was, because it's still aligned to the heavens and astronomically. And when I was talking with Graham Hancock when he was here, we were talking about the incredible Ohio Serpent Mound and how that was really saved, you know, because the development didn't go there, because we were just lucky to have it at all. And but the Serpent Mound, and the way that when you get to the summer solstice, it actually ingests the moon. I think that this is the kind of remarkable, what we're seeing is the real technology and the real how these cultures were in touch with nature, and they understood nature. And at some point we just became divorced from that, and I think we've been under that kind of cloud. We've been under that wall where they're separating our consciousness from who we truly are. And that, as I started with the Steiner quote, that seems to be the goal of these groups, which is to get us away from our real spiritual background, spiritual understanding, and understanding of ourselves as a spiritual being along with being a physical being. It seems to be that is really the great secret, isn't it? Yes, Miss Olivia.
Michael John was asking earlier, what is the link between Salem and Jerusalem, which I understand to be the new Salem, Jeru meaning new?
Yeah, I like that question. I mean, I think with the names, this is how they got it, and I think that they chose Salem for that very reason. But the genealogy of the name, I think, is definitely biblical. You know, what's fascinating is when you look at the Steiner work, and when they talk about New Jerusalem, and in Revelations and things like, you know, the Ascension and all these types of things, he's very clear that they're talking about this new Jupiter, which is what the Earth is moving toward. And the way that he sizes it up, if we just strip away all the religious imagery for a moment, is there's one group that likes to control humanity and wants to create an artificial step for it, which is the eighth sphere. So that's the group that he identifies as this harmonic group, and the way to lock us in is a kind of virtual reality. So, our minds it is kind of like the Matrix in many ways. And of course, Steiner's ideas are taken for things, and he's not attributed very often. And then the other group is trying to do something, create a kind of spiritual etheric warmth so that Earth, its evolutionary pattern goes on as it should, and then we create this new Jupiter, and that's where New Jerusalem and all these things come from in these religions. So it's interesting when you get into the names and then you look at it from anthroposophy, which is definitely as close to a mystery school as you get in public. And you start to see that that's a big thing to let us in on, which is that the evolution process that's happening is what we're moving toward. And so this idea of harvesting humanity by giving us this eighth sphere artificial step instead, that's the battle that's taking place. So it gets deep in that cosmology. The final question of the night, Miss Olivia.
This isn't a question, but this is an experience, but I thought I would share it.
Yes.
So I saved this. Aether said that in 2005 it went to Salem. I encountered the spirit of a young girl who told me the area was cursed. She said, my heart was true and wished to warn me. I never went back. The experience still haunts me. When I came home, she showed me how she passed away in the dream state with the trials. It was very painful, but I felt she was reaching out to me in her own way.
Quite remarkable. Quite remarkable.
I have to say, I've been up to Salem quite a bit, and although I like the North Shore a lot, I don't like that area. There's some beautiful architecture and beautiful parks, but there is something underlying it that's unsettling, that's unresolved, I think, energetically.
It might have a lot to do with the spiritual unrest from this period, which is remarkable, and I think this is why we remember that time and why it is so stark, because they came out here to form a new world, and then we have this, very hysterical situation that comes out of the blue. And when we look at Cayce's take on it, he literally is saying, when they asked him about the Salem witch trials, he said it's basically pearls before swine, which is that some of the things that were coming through were from a spiritual place, and the people who were manipulating the circumstances for their own benefit were degrading and accusing their enemies and all the rest. And the other thing is that he really speaks about Salem as, people getting spiritual messages. And Steiner talks about them plugging into the spiritual world and things. So if you think about it that way, it becomes even twice a tragedy, because here they were opening up and moving the culture along with opening up to this new spiritual avenue, and this is how they shut it down. So a remarkable story, and it's...
Okay, hold on, I just want to say, D.E. Saccone says, I used to run a shop in Salem, Crow Haven Corner. That's Lori Cabot's shop.
Hey!
I could tell you stories. I'd like to hear those stories. Please contact us.
Absolutely. Well, Lori Cabot, of course, the Salem witch. Is she the official witch of Salem? And I think her daughter does it now. But it's very interesting, and of course, very controversial history there. But
I have to say, when I was a teenager, I didn't know well. I at least once went up to Salem and did a spell on the sidewalk, and everybody was walking by and going woo. But I have to say, I had a very, very short foray into sort of witchcraft, and I was really good at it, and with it in very basic ways. And I found that I didn't like the karma attached to it.
Oh, of course.
So I gave it up. But
no, you're a natural intuitive, is what it is.
I think if you're in touch with your feelings manifest things, right?
Yes.
But then you have to deal with the consequences of that and the guilt of that. And
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not good.
Well, this is the whole good witch, bad witch thing, you know, because you have all the white magic people thinking it's the
I don't
greatest
like
thing in the world.
willing things personally. You know, I don't like forcing things. It doesn't feel right.
Yeah, well, you're more like you're more zen
I'd
than
like
that.
to be in alignment with my highest potential that God has designed for me,
Yes.
not for me to dictate to the universe what I want. I feel like the
Yes.
universe knows best, right?
No question about it. Well, we can see that people who have incredible abilities, like Cayce or like Gigi, for example, Gigi Young, who working with her when she's working in a psychic zone is a remarkable thing because you'd be convinced in a moment that psychic reality is real. She's that good, and she's been fantastic helping with the X series. But you can see that if you go back a few centuries, people with those abilities would have been incredibly. Even Cayce, as it was, got thrown out of so many different churches that he was the Sunday school teacher about as soon as they found out, hey, this guy's the sleeping prophet. They're like, he's of the devil. And, this is like the 1920s and 30s. So it is. And we see, we do still see a lot of superstition around it. And this is when the religious zealot aspect becomes also overbearing, as does the incredible, scientific materialistic. You can't think of religion. If you think of religion, then we're going to. What did they do? They recently, when somebody was praying in school, they kicked the kid out of school for praying. I mean, this is the kind of incredible fascist thing. So you have these weird things, and I always say it comes from different sides. It's like different manifestations of the same thing. And on one side, you have people saying you have to be, a Bible thumper, or being incredibly oppressive on the religious end. And then on the other side, you have people who are trying to strip any sense of spirituality from you. So it is, I think, on a daily basis, we were dealing with that. And in truth, your spirituality has to be the most personal thing of all the choices that you make in life. So it really shouldn't be in anybody else's hands but yours. And with that, I will ask Miss Olivia. Actually, I'll do a shout out because I see a few great people. And Daniel Browning's out there, Esoteric 369. It's fantastic. Carmen Bolter, yes, absolutely. I love Carmen Bolter. She's going to be coming back on the program. We are in touch, but I need to talk to her. Bruce Wayne, thank you so much. And fantastic, Occult fan. We had a great night with you tonight. Thomas Tyson, fantastic. Kate, if you're out there, it's great to see you. Tessa1111, Scruples, Najat, fantastic people tonight. We will be back, actually, next week we'll be back with a recorded show. We won't be live with the X Series. And then 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be back with a new X Series episode. And so it's great to have everyone here. Thank you so much. And we are going to have Gigi Young back, even though she was on the beach tonight and couldn't make it with the internet that they had over there. We hope it's a great weekend for her and for you. And Miss Olivia, how would you like to round it out?
I would like to thank some super chatters.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so Jinx Jackson, Big Papa Pump, Lisa Frequency, Xavier Figueroa, Bill Gometz, Charles Marlowe, and Amy Chen. Thank you so very much.
Fantastic. And we had a great lifetime membership contribution from Henry in the UK, and I want to say thank you very much for supporting our work here. And I highly recommend everyone go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, stay in touch with us, get behind the show, subscribe to the show, and make sure it comes to you every week on Friday at 8 o'clock. And we will see you next week.
Yeah, I also want to say you worked harder on this episode than I've seen you work. I mean, it was really constant. Every single day from morning till night.
I still have a whole episode I could do here.
So everybody, I'm going to encourage you to show your appreciation for DJ because he's really devoting so many hours to this, so much work. And paper and ink. And
it's incredible. I got to tell you, I enjoy every minute of it. And I appreciate everyone getting behind the show. We will be back in 2 weeks. We'll be back next Friday with a great recorded interview. I'm not going to tell you who it is yet, but it's very exciting. And Olivia, with that, I guess all I can say is, what's for dinner?
I'm sorry. It's going to be onion rings again. This is the tradition right now.
That's not bad.
They're fast.
Listen, hey.
And they're always satisfying.
Remember, with contributions, you're getting into Olivia's sriracha bill, right?
Sriracha ketchup.
Thanks, everyone, and have a fantastic weekend. Didn't you say today was someday?
No, it's Sunday is Hobbit Day.
Oh, that's what it is. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so have a great Hobbit Day.
Happy Hobbit Day.
As it were, and great to see everyone tonight. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
And I will end the broadcast, but you know what?
What?
It never ends. It never ends. Good night, everyone.